Okay, and that is simply the nerve cells communicating to one another. They do that by secreting chemicals, and they also do that as they actually touch one another. Okay, this is the communication of the nerve cells, and we'll talk about that. So, this is probably the most complex thing that we know, all right? That's pretty much known to man, the human brain here, all right? So let's go a little bit further here into the area of the brain particularly that we are learning about here, and this is the reward pathway of the brain. So when we experience something pleasurable, okay, food, good food, sex, water, something pleasurable, vacation with the family, it is recorded in what we call the VTA, or the ventral tegmental area. You don't have to memorize that, but you just need to know there's a pathway in the brain that's specific for pleasure, all right? It is then recorded in what we call the nucleus accumbens, which is actually where we experience the feelings of elation, okay? And then it is passed on to the prefrontal cortex, all right? And that is because it is in the prefrontal cortex that we decide whether or not this is really worth it, whether or not we want to do it again, right? So, the brain has a characteristic that we call plasticity, okay? Plasticity. That means that the brain is highly moldable. It is changeable. It can adapt itself depending on the circumstances, the situation, depending on its environment, okay? We call it experience-dependent plasticity, okay? And what that simply means is that the brain will change based on our experiences and based on our environment. Now, how does the brain know what our environment is? How does the brain know what our experiences is? And that's very simple. That's through our five senses. Through our five senses, the brain knows our environment, and it changes so that it makes whatever is happening in our environment much easier to do, okay? So those 100 billion nerve cells, they're communicating. It's like a committee that gets together and say, hey, what are they doing? What's going on with them? Okay, I see that they continue to do this. Let's make it easy for them, okay? And so there you have the formation of habits, but more importantly, you have the change of the brain. So that is foundational for understanding the addicted brain, is that the brain can actually change based on our constant choices, based on our often frequented environment. Okay? Now, let's talk about these two areas of the brain here that's really important. All right? Let's talk about first this area here, which is the prefrontal cortex. Okay? The prefrontal cortex contains the frontal lobe. All right? Now let's talk about the function of the frontal lobe. Of course, you probably have some idea of what the frontal lobe is responsible for and what it does, right? One of the things that we ascribe to the frontal lobe is that it is responsible for, it's the place where we make what? Decisions. That's right. It's the seat of the wheel. It is decision maker, the decision maker. But you know, the frontal lobe does much more than that. The frontal lobe is what we call the executive power of the brain. So not only does it make decisions, but the frontal lobe is also responsible for behavior planning. Okay? This is where we plan a particular behavior and execute. It is also responsible for what we call emotion regulation. Now that's important. That's going to be especially important on tomorrow. Okay? Emotion regulation. In other words, it is the frontal lobe that keeps fear from getting out of control. It is the frontal lobe that keeps anxiety and anger from getting out of control. Emotion regulation. It is the frontal lobe that keeps stress at bay, right? It is also responsible for morality. Okay, here's where morality is. The frontal lobe is where we ascribe value to things. Okay? Reason, conscience, judgment, all here in the frontal lobe. Okay? So, very, very important part of the brain. It is the executive power of the brain. Virtually nothing happens without the frontal lobe's involvement. Okay? So that's how important it is. Spirituality is determined here in the frontal lobe. Okay? We're going to talk just a little bit about that as well. So spirituality is determined here in the frontal lobe. All right? Now, there is another part of the brain that is important to understand here, and that's this area here. And I mentioned that this is where the amygdala is. Okay? This part of the brain we'll call the lower brain. Okay? So you have this part here, the frontal lobe, we'll call the higher brain, right? This part is the lower brain. The lower brain does not concern itself with reasoning from cause to effect. The lower brain does not concern itself with right or wrong. That's the frontal lobe. The lower brain concerns itself with two things: survival and pleasure. All right? That's all it's interested in. Many people call this the primitive part of the brain. I like to use another term. I like to call it the instinctual part of the brain. Okay? The instinctual part of the brain. All right? So, does not reason. It only concerns itself with what feels good now. Okay? And what is necessary for survival. Okay? Got that? Higher brain, lower brain. All right. So let's go forward here. And let's talk about what takes place when we experience something pleasurable. So what you have here are two cells. Okay? The dark space between the cells we call the synapse. The synapse is simply the meeting place between two cells. Okay? It's to where the two cells come together. All right? Now, dopamine is what we call a neurotransmitter. Remember I mentioned to you that the cells communicate in both chemical and material messages. Well, this is one of the chemical messages we call a neurotransmitter, dopamine. It is responsible for what? It's a chemical release when we experience something pleasurable. Absolutely. Pleasurable. That's dopamine. Okay. So starry figure here. If you notice, on the neighboring cell, we have specialized protein called dopamine receptors. One cell releases, the other cell receives. Okay? Let's look at how this works here. You also have, in this process, notice the green arrows, as dopamine is released from one cell because we've experienced something pleasurable, it is received by the neighboring cell. Then you have specialized protein called dopamine transporters. The transporters take the dopamine from the neighboring cell, and notice what it does. It takes it back to the cell from which it came from. This signifies an end of the pleasurable experience. Okay? That means it's over. It's done. Okay? This is in the normal functioning brain. All right? Norvalco says drugs of abuse increase the concentration of dopamine in the brain's reward circuits. Okay? So something goes awfully wrong in the brain when drugs and alcohol enter. So let's talk about what happens here and what goes wrong in the brain as a result of drugs and alcohol entering. So we talked about the higher brain and the lower brain, right? So far we've talked about natural rewards: food, sex, vacation, time with the family, right? So forth and so on. These are all natural rewards, okay? The problem is, based on what we understand about drugs and alcohol, is that the dopamine that is released from drugs and alcohol is way different from the dopamine that's released from simply having a good meal. Way different. In fact, there is a great disparity between the dopamine that is released even from having sex than from the high that comes from drugs and alcohol. Okay? So much so that over time, the consistent presence of drugs and alcohol in the brain causes the brain to change. So let me give you an example of the disparity in dopamine here. So let's say Pastor Giles, if I whisper his name in his ear, okay, versus taking a bullhorn and shouting his name in his ear, right? Now that last one's going to hurt, right? That's going to hurt. That is just a cruel illustration of the difference of dopamine from drugs and alcohol versus natural rewards. They don't compare. It is the consistent presence of drugs and alcohol in the brain that causes an overwhelming cascade of dopamine. More than what the brain is used to receiving and more than what the brain is actually prepared to receive, that actually causes changes. Okay? So, let's go a little bit further here. Here is cocaine, for example, right? So, remember that normal, pleasurable experience? Yeah. Dopamine released from one cell, received by the next, taken back to the other cell, and that's it. Notice, cocaine attaches itself to the dopamine transporters, right? And does not allow them to return to the neighboring cells. Okay? Users call that high. Okay? We call it high. All right? There's an overconcentration of dopamine in the synaptic area of the brain. It's not supposed to be there. It's not supposed to be like that. Once that happens on a continuous basis, then we have a really big problem. Once a person has experienced addiction, changes have taken place in the brain that involve multiple brain circuits. So what are we talking about here? So here's what happens. So drugs and alcohol's consistent presence brings an overwhelming cascade of dopamine in the brain, changing the environment of the brain. Because remember, the first thing that we said about the brain is that it is experience-dependent plasticity. It's just like if you have some leftover dish from potluck and you take some plastic wrap and you fit it around that dish, whether it's square, whether it's round, you can fit it around anything. Is that right? The brain is the exact same way. So, keep in mind that dopamine itself is not enough to cause addiction. Okay? True enough, there's overwhelming amount of dopamine, but that alone is not enough to cause changes in the brain. There is another neurotransmitter that teams up with dopamine that causes changes in the brain. This neurotransmitter is called glutamate. What did I say? Glutamate. Glutamate, and it is spelled just like it sounds. Glutamate. Now, what is glutamate responsible for? Glutamate is responsible for three main things. Number one, it's responsible for learning. Glutamate is a neurotransmitter that is released in the brain that enables us to learn a behavior. Okay? That's what it does. It allows us to learn a behavior. But glutamate doesn't limit itself to just our learning the behavior. Glutamate is also responsible for memory, and it is also responsible for mood. Three things: learning, memory, and what was the last thing? Mood. So, here's what happens. Glutamate learns the behavior, locks it into memory, records the emotional response before the behavior, during the behavior, and after the behavior is over. Right? So it is the reason why many people who are addicted to drugs and alcohol, or who have an addicted brain because of certain behaviors, is a reason why they have very hypersensitive memories. Okay? There are cues in the environment that actually trigger brain cells for what we call relapse. Okay? Passing down a familiar street, seeing a familiar person. It is so intense that even if I put on clothes, okay, that I oftentimes get high in, it will trigger circuits for relapse in the brain. Okay? So, what I hear, what I see, what I smell, okay, The brain has recorded all of my environment. Okay? Very interesting that a person who was addicted can remember everything about the experience of getting high. Or they can remember everything about the experience of their addicted behavior. They will dream about it. They can repeat it with their eyes closed in pitch dark. Okay? It is like second nature. Okay? The brain has learned the behavior, locked it into memory, and recorded the mood. It is the reason why that a person, even when they know, the brain knows that they are about to engage or indulge in the behavior, right? That they begin to experience an emotional response. And they haven't even gotten to the behavior yet. It hasn't even happened. Yet they're having an emotional response that the body says we're preparing for what we know is about to happen. Okay? Now, let me back up just a little bit, because I want to let you know how intense this is. Yes, on the one hand, this is certainly what we call a learned behavior, okay, that triggers a certain response to the brain. But also, you need to know that this is more than just a learned behavior, that this is something that may very well be a part of a person's genetic makeup. Amen. Especially when it comes to substance abuse. The research shows that it has over 60% genetic factor. What that means is a person who has a family history of addiction is 60% more likely to develop the addiction should they engage in the behavior, as opposed to an individual who does not have a family history. Okay? So there are decisions that that individual makes that actually turns on their genetic makeup, their genetic predisposition, right, to that particular behavior. So they're not just battling something that we call a cultivated, but they're also battling what we call an inherited tendency. Okay? So keep that in mind. So what they're dealing with is something that is biological. Amen. Okay? There's a force inside of them that oftentimes they don't even understand, that's driving them to that particular behavior. Along with the fact that now, since they have engaged in the behavior, the connection between glutamate and dopamine. Glutamate has learned the behavior, locked it into memory, recorded the mood, right? And the two have now created this effect in the brain. So what is the brain's response, right? You take it in, drugs and alcohol, it's overwhelming cascade of dopamine. Glutamate says, wait a minute, let me learn this, what's happening here, let me record this, right? The consistent presence of drugs and alcohol in the brain. So the brain, two changes that happen in the brain. The first is that the brain stops producing its own natural dopamine. Now, that's very significant, because what that means is that natural rewards are no longer appealing. Remember I told you about the disparity between natural rewards and the high from drugs and alcohol? Okay? You can't go from that back down to this, just like that. It's not going to happen, right? So now, time with the family and even sex and good food, it does nothing. Okay? So the brain says, well, listen, since all of this dopamine is coming in, why do I need to release my own dopamine? We've got plenty. Now, what does that mean? Natural rewards are no longer appealing. And now, in order for the person to feel good or even feel normal, they need the presence of dopamine. But the presence of dopamine, because of the change of the brain, is now solely tied to, guess what? Drugs and alcohol. So you see, I have to do it in order to feel right. Because when I don't, I feel anything but normal. I feel anything but good. You see? So the brain stops producing its own natural dopamine. Now, here's the other thing that happens. The other change that happens, remember I told you that we looked at two areas of the brain. We looked at the prefrontal cortex, the higher brain, and then we looked at the lower brain. Well, in a normal functioning brain, there is a top-down control, right? Remember I told you that? The higher brain is kind of like the brakes on the lower brain. Okay? The lower brain is only concerned with survival and pleasure. Right? So it is the higher brain that says to the lower brain, listen, you've had enough chocolate cake. You cannot eat the whole thing. Okay? It is the higher brain that says you cannot binge on Netflix because you got to go to work early in the morning. Okay? Oh, I'm sorry, we're in church. Nobody here binges on Netflix. But it's the higher brain, right? That is the rational thinking part of the brain that puts things into a healthy perspective. It is the frontal lobe part of the brain that says no. Okay? Well, because of the influence of drugs and alcohol, there's something that has happened with the lower brain. Pleasure is now on an equal level with, guess what? Survival. Okay? Pleasure is on an equal level with survival. So what we're saying is that to get the fix, to do the behavior, it's a life and death situation. I have to do it. Right? It's a life and death situation. So here's what happens. That top-down control in the addictive brain is actually reversed. So the brain stops producing its own natural dopamine. It depends on the dopamine that's brought in by alcohol and drugs. And now the lower brain is in control of the higher brain. That's why people with addictive brains and addictive behaviors, that's why they do things that don't make sense. That's why they do things that are high risk. That's why they do things that jeopardize their freedom, jeopardize their family, jeopardize their financial security. That's why they do things that, to a person on the outside saying, like, what's wrong with you? How could you do that? Right? They do things that they themselves don't even understand why. Okay? Now, the research shows that chronic stress does the same thing. Individuals who are under chronic stress have a shutdown of the frontal lobe. Many a man or woman is in the penitentiary because of what they did in a moment of chronic stress. And when you ask them what happened, why was it? I don't know, right? So, if stress can shut down the frontal lobe, how much more can addiction to drugs and alcohol, addiction to pornography, addiction to food, gambling addiction, addiction to television, how much more can that shut down the frontal lobe? And so you have in the addictive brain, a brain in which the lower brain is now exerting a down-up control instead of the front brain, the frontal lobe, doing a top-down control. So for many of my clients that I work with and I deal with, this part of the brain hasn't been active in a long time. Hasn't been active in a long time. They're not used to that. They're used to acting off of the lower brain, which says, hey, go do it. It's like driving a car and the brakes don't work. Everything is go, go, go. Right? That's pretty scary, isn't it? You can't stop. Probation officer says, hey, man, you keep doing this, you're going to jail. Okay, I'll stop. Go, go, go. The wife says, look, you keep doing this, it's over. Okay, go, go, go. You keep going, you keep going, you keep going. This part of the brain is shut down. The lower brain is running the place. So now you have a real biological issue. Combine that with the fact that you already have a genetic predisposition. You already had that. Now you have jumped, as they say, from the frying pan into the fire. Right? So you have a compulsive behavior that drives you. You have no idea how to stop. Right? So what do? And a lot of people that I work with, and I think sometimes as a church we can fall into this as well. We have to be very careful, even with our own spiritual lives, right? Because we tend to operate on this premise, which is a misconception. And that is, if you know better, you should do better. Okay? But I don't want you to raise your hand. How many of you have done things, made decisions that you knew better, but you did it anyway? Okay? So that right there shows you that knowledge is not a strong enough motivator for change. Okay? Knowledge is not a strong enough motivator for change. That's a misconception. And I always tell people that misconceptions lead to misapplications. Okay? How do I stop this compulsion that's driving my life, that's driving me in the ground, right? So we've got a real biological issue here, and that the brain has changed, and the brain now works in a way that is against me and not for me, right? All right. So, what are those multiple circuits? Reward. For the addicted brain, the only reward is the satisfaction of repeating the behavior, the addictive behavior. My motivation is tied to the addicted behavior, whether it's a substance or whether it's a behavior. My drive, I'm driven only for the behavior. Memory, right? We talked about that hypersensitive memory. Conditioning, okay? When I try to help clients to understand that because of glutamate, right? Because of how the brain works and how the brain is always associating behavior with environment. It is always associating behavior with environment. It is always prioritizing. It is always taking in and condensing information and trying to figure out where this information belongs. And so what happens is, if the conditions are right, if the environment is right, we have almost a predetermined response. And usually this is, especially when it comes to stress or anger. See, the addictive behavior attaches itself to your emotions. Because remember, your brain records how you feel before, during, and after. Okay? Every time you get angry, you watch pornography. Right? Or every time you feel deprived, you eat. Right? So what happens is, when those emotions come up because of life stress, guess what? The brain has almost an automated response, right? Self-control, we have a lack of self-control, and of course we talked about this compulsion that drives the individual. All right, so how do we get well? And before we go there, are there any questions on the addicted brain? Okay, so let's review. Yes.
It actually goes way back up. When you said that the brain change based on our constant action, it will say, let's help them out. There's something that takes place and they say, they like this, let's help them out, right?
Yes.
So, is that good or bad?
Well, it's not a good or bad thing. It's simply the nature of the brain. That's how it works. That's how habits are formed. It recognizes your patterns. You keep making the same choices. Therefore, the brain says it recognizes that choice. And because of glutamate, dopamine, the brain is naturally made to remember our pleasurable experiences so that we will repeat them. The problem is when those pleasurable experiences are destructive. So habits is something that we cannot help, whether they're good or bad. It's just the way the brain operates. It is going to form habit.
Okay, you're thinking of plastic. It can be shaped and molded. So, okay, Jim, you give me the example of that. Okay, all right.
Yes.
So, one more quick.
Okay. The glutamate, that's the same as monosodium glutamate,
No.
pretty much. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter. That's why,
No. Okay. So I know what you're thinking about. So let's talk about excitatory neurotransmitters. Okay. This is not the same thing that's in your Saison seasoning, which I have at home in my cabinet, by the way. Or cinnamon, not that type. Okay. So here's what happens. All right. For every pattern of behavior there is what we call a neuronal circuitry. Okay? What that means is, let's say that this group of people, okay, I do some traveling on my job sometimes, so I ended up in Chillicothe, Ohio, in the Chillicothe before. So they have the original Krispy Kreme donut. Now, if you haven't been there, don't go. I'm telling you right now. All right? It's not spelled with a K. It's spelled with a C. That's how you know it's the original Krispy Kreme. All right? So for every time I go down there, I find myself at the counter. All right? Now my intention is to say 2, please. They have these donuts called Mountain Tops. They're just 2. But 6 comes out. And instead of grabbing the bag, she grabs the box. Right? Then I go back to my hotel room. And I'm by myself, you know, away from the family. Of course, I'm feeling sorry for myself. You see? So I'm already setting myself up. I eat 2. After eating 2, I feel guilty. Right? Like, hey, all right, I'm picking out that I can't do this tomorrow. Right? I'm going to be down here for 4 or 5 days. I can't do this tomorrow. So if I can't do this tomorrow, well, what am I going to do with the 4 that's left? I can't waste my money. Right? You see how this works? You know, I can't waste my money. So now you can probably already guess what happens to the rest of the donuts.
Yeah.
But the point is that for our oft-repeated habits and behaviors, there is a group of nerve cells that represent that particular behavior. That's what we mean when we say neuronal circuitry. Okay? So, when it comes to addictive patterns and behaviors, it's the same thing. There's a group of nerve cells that represent that particular behavior. All right? So, when I get ready to indulge in that behavior, there is a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Okay? We call it ACH for short, but it is acetylcholine. It is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Its job is to fire activity in that neuronal circuitry, in that group of nerve cells that represent my Krispy Kreme behavior. Okay? So its job is to go along and it hurries from cell to cell, hurries the message along that he's about to do it, he's doing it, so forth and so on. So the activity of that cell increases, right? Now, what happens though when a person makes what we call a different decision, a wheel-directed decision that is altogether different from the decision that they used to make, okay? All you have to do is do it once. When we do that, whether it's cocaine or alcohol or sugar or pornography or television, whatever it is, when you say, you know what, I can remember my last night out in Chillicothe, I said, I'm going out with a bang. I had already predetermined that the night before, I'm going out with a bang. I'm going to give me like a dozen. So when I'm talking to them, you know I got a problem, right? That just ain't normal. But the morning that I was on my way out, I said, you know what? I'm not going to do it. I ain't going to do that. Right? Now my wife does not know this today. She's still that I haven't told her at all. She doesn't know about my Krispy Kreme binges. But what happens is, one wheel-directed choice that is different from the choice that we made. There is another neurotransmitter that is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It is called GABA for short, but the longer name is gamma-aminobutyric acid. What it does is it jumps into that old pathway. It stops acetylcholine's activity in that nerve pathway that represents the old behavior and redirects it.
Yes, sir.
It's like clogging up a dam
Yes.
and causing the water to go in another direction. Now acetylcholine goes into the direction of the new pathway that I'm forming. That's based on the new behaviors, the new choices, the new environment, the new people. Over time, the old pathway that represents my old behavior will never go away. The research shows it will never dissipate. That means that no matter how long I have abstained, relapse is always a possibility.
Yes.
It's still there. I tell the clients that I work with, your brain will never forget the first time you got high. Never. Okay? Never. but it will weaken. And as I engage in the new behaviors, the new decisions, so forth and so on, the new pathway will grow stronger. And over time, with effort and support, that top-down control will once again take place in the brain. But it takes a lot of time for that to happen, and a lot of other ingredients that I'm going to talk about here, and we're going to close with this. So, when we talk about inhibitory and excitatory, there's a difference there with foods. Now, there's a connection with food, because there are certain foods, right? There's a connection between food and mood, right? And we've already talked about that there are certain feelings and emotions that put me in the direction of that addictive behavior, okay? So, so that is what happens, you know, in the brain on a neurological level. Yes, sir.
So I was thinking that we're given natural desires
Yes.
out there. And those natural desires can be satisfied. But what I'm hearing is that you have unnatural desires, lust, greed. Something happens to the brain that they cannot really be truly satisfied. Is that my understanding?
Yes, so keep this in mind, that it's easier to form a bad habit than a good habit. Why is that?
See,
Huh?
see,
Because of our carnal nature. So Ellen White talks about a bend towards evil. We're already bent in that direction, right? So to form the positive ones, painstaking effort, right? Painstaking effort. So because of that, we're more naturally inclined to the negative patterns and behaviors. The brain is simply doing its thing. It's doing what it does, regardless of which way, you know, that you are. However, there is something in those negative habits and patterns that, because of the way the brain works, is unsatisfying. And we know that from a spiritual basis, right? The Bible says, there is no peace, saith my God, to the wicked, right? Which means if you're living that way, God says you're not at peace. I don't care how much you claim you're not at peace, because God says there's no peace there. There's no fulfillment there. Isaiah 43:7 says, you were created for my glory. We were created with a holy and divine purpose in mind. We were created to fulfill the purpose of reflecting God's image. The brain works the way it does because God intended that when he created Adam, that by beholding Jesus and by walking with Jesus day in and day out, Adam will become more and more and more like him. The impress of Jesus will be embossed in the mind of Adam. That's why in Revelation, the Bible says, of the 144,000, the Father's name is written where?
forehead.
The forehead. Right? That's how, and that's the purpose for which we were created. So the devil wants to come along with all kinds of gimmies and gadgets, right? And he wants to impress something else upon the forehead, right? So, so let's talk about what are some necessary changes here that needs to be made. Changes in thoughts and attitude, okay? The way we think about that particular experience, that particular addiction, the behavior, the way we think about it must change. If you tell yourself it's the only way that I can enjoy myself, it's the only thing that brings satisfaction, you're going to have a problem, right? Because that attitude connects you to that behavior. It binds you to that behavior. And so this suggests that there needs to be a change in our thinking. The way I think about it has to be challenged. It has to change. Attitude drives behavior. Attitude drives behavior. Okay? So if my attitude doesn't change, my behavior remains the same, right? Environment always talk about two environments. Your external environment, right? Which many people make changes in their external environment. They get all the chips and the Oreos and the ice cream out of the house, right? But the internal environment is neglected. Your internal environment are your thoughts, your feelings, right? If you don't deal with your thoughts and your feelings, you will recreate your external environment that you just changed. You will recreate it all over again. You see? For a lasting change happens from the inside out, right? So changing your external environment, but not neglecting your internal environment is key. And for some people, for a lot of people actually, their internal environment is driven, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow, is driven by their anger, fear, and resentment towards God. Okay? And people in their lives that have damaged them and violated them. You understand?
Amen.
So you see, the internal environment can be a very powerful driving force in these addictive behaviors and attitudes. Lifestyle choices, here's where your nutrition comes in. Here's where you want to be careful of those things that can trigger this biological disaster to continue, right? Getting proper rest, nutrition, water, your 8 laws of health. Here's where all of that comes into place. That's a piece of the pie. Oftentimes what happens, especially in Adventist communities, is we make the nutrition the whole pie. But there's a lot of people who are vegetarians who are miserable. Marriages are unhappy. They have heart of discontent and unforgiveness. Because they're vegetarians, they're even vegans, right? But they neglect their emotional and their spiritual health. That's why Paul said the gospel is not meat and drink.
All right.
Those things are helpful. Those things are great. But they're meant to be complementary. They're not an end in themselves. Support system is also important. It's very interesting. When you look at the Bible here, and we're going to close in like 2 minutes. When you look at the Bible, it talks about, in Galatians chapter 6, verse 1 and 2, if one of you be taken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one with meekness and fear, right? Verse 2, bear ye one another's burdens.
Amen.
You know what this says? That individuals with addictive habits and behaviors, you know what they need? Community. Community. Without community, it's not that you can't make it, but it's going to be a lot harder. So where is that community? Is it the church? I can tell you, for a lot of people, it is not the church. Okay? There's this whole movement against religion today. People are wanting to be spiritual, but not religious, because they associate religious with organized church. Okay? So I have an article at home in Time magazine that says, forget the church and give me Jesus. Right? It's like, you know what they're saying? Here's what they're really saying. I've been in church, and I've been so disappointed by people. Right? See, when I work with individuals who are struggling with addiction, it's not that I'm trying to introduce them to the Savior. Right? They're being introduced to the Savior already in me. You understand that?
I know.
My connection with them is their connection to the Savior. See? So when I tell people, hey, you need to go do this, you need to go do that, it'll help. Following your word, following my word, is like following the word of Jesus. Why? Because at that moment, they believe what I'm telling you. But guess where I got what I'm telling you?
All right.
Right? So they come back and they say, you worked. Well, I know it worked. It wasn't me, not because I'm smart or because I'm some healer or anything, but because my connection with the Savior. Because I know that in me dwelleth no good thing. right? Nothing good comes out of me, only from Jesus. So, when we interact with people, it is their interaction with us, right, that connects them to the Savior. All right, so, community. Survival tools, okay? Survival tools have to do with cravings, those vulnerable times in our lives. What do we do when we are depressed or stressed? Or what do we do when we are in conflict or have crisis going on in our lives? How do we navigate those rough waters? And then finally, spiritual connection. So when I work with clients, I cannot mention Jesus. I can say God. But the minute I mention Jesus, now I'm being specific toward Christianity. That I cannot do. It's fine. It's no barrier at all. Because when I talk about, first of all, when I teach about the frontal lobe, and I explain to them and help them understand the importance of caring for their frontal lobe, you know that's spirituality right there. Do you know why? Because the brain is the only avenue by which God can communicate with me.
Amen.
That's it.
Yeah.
So teaching them basic principles, how to unclog this, right? So you can connect more fully,
All right.
right, with God. Helps. Now, I don't say it like that. I don't need to.
Right.
I give them the practical. And all of a sudden they're thinking much clearer. All of a sudden they're more open. It's easier for them to change their attitude about certain things, so forth and so on. So I teach spirituality as this. Number one, how you relate to yourself and how you relate to the world around you. Okay? All of that happens with your brain. You develop relationships with your brain. You have thoughts about yourself with your brain. You make a decision to surrender to God with your brain. All of that with your brain. Right? So, if I teach and we talk about, and it's not just teaching, I don't want to give you a misguide you, it's also about relationship.
Amen.
It's also about relationship. Guy, I'll give you an example. A guy asked me just yesterday, I also run a group called HEAT, and it's for African American males from the ages of 18 to 29 who are caught up in the criminal justice system. Favorite group. I love it. These guys, they drink and smoke marijuana, but these guys sell drugs and run through women. All right? I love it. It's raw. So they asked me the other day, and I'm like, how could you, I had to, first of all, I told them, I said, listen, I was there. I know what that's like. I went to college, I had two things on my mind. Girls and fraternities. That's it. Almost lost my life over it, but that's what was on my mind. Say, now, I'm married. Happily married. How could you? I said, one of the reasons why I didn't want to get married for a long time is because I said to myself, and I was honest with the Lord, I can't see myself with one woman. So why would I get married? There's so many women all over the world, beautiful. Why would I? No. I don't want to hurt nobody. You know what I'm saying? I said, but I've been married for 18 years. Successful and happy. You know why? This is a conversation we're having. And then I go, why? What? I said, y'all want to know? No. Y'all want to? Yes, but tell me, Mr. Antonio, tell me why. What did you find? I said, I found that there is no woman alive that can satisfy me. I don't care how voluptuous she is. I don't care how beautiful. No woman alive can satisfy me. Only a God can.
Yes, sir.
So,
Yes.
God loves me through my wife. That's the only way I can be married to a woman. And that's the only way I can tell you that nothing out here compares to what I have at home. I had to come to that. Right? And so, man, when I said that, that was their response. And then we just went on. Right? We just went on. My point is relationship.
Yeah.
So I have a relationship with them. Right? So as I have a relationship, now I can drop certain things on them and allow the Lord to work. So, how you relate to yourself, how you relate to the world around you, and your overall meaning and purpose in life. Why are you here? Why are you here? What's the meaning of your life? All of those chromosomes, those 20 chromosomes from here and 23, why did it have to be you? Why are you here? And so when people think about that, that's spiritual. That's spiritual, right? What is your purpose? Why are you here. All right, so everything happens with the brain. All right, so I'll close with a story here. There was a farmer who found an eaglet, all right, baby eagle, and of course, yeah, we don't do with baby eagle, but he had a chicken farm, so he put the eaglet in his chicken farm. So he's raising the eaglet with his chickens, right? And so, of course, as the eaglet started getting older and growing, the eaglet was acting like the chickens. It was making the sounds like the chickens. It was walking like the chickens, but it wasn't a chicken, it was an eaglet. Of course, the features were very obvious. These are two different animals here. One day, over the sky, over the barn, there was this shrieking sound. That's what it was.
Eagle.
It was a fully grown eagle. So, the eagle in the barn is being raised with the chickens, looks up and glares. Like, wow, they look like me, right? So, flap his wings a little bit, start feeling strong and confident, that there was some inner strength that was untapped, right? Am I really a chicken? Or am I an eagle? And then again, swoosh with this shrilling sound piercing through the sky, right? King of the air, an eagle, right? This time, the eagle that was raised with the chicken made a sound back, flapped his wings, and guess what? Flew up out of there and left the chickens behind. You know why? Because he realized he was not a chicken. He's an eagle. His purpose was not to scowl around the ground, but to soar and to fly high, high in the air, over the mountains. So, I ask you, what's your purpose?
All right.
Why were you created? What were you meant to do? I want to tell you, we were meant to have loving, lasting relationships. We were meant for a destiny beyond the stars, to live with God throughout the ceaseless ages of eternity. To soar high, high in the sky, higher than the highest human thought. Is God's ideal
Yes, sir.
for us. Right? May God help us to realize we don't belong down here.
Yes, sir.
We were created for up here.
Amen.
Right?
Amen.
May we become all that God ever intended for us to be. Right? May we rise above our challenges, our difficulties, and our addictions. And may we find the peace of God that He so longs to give us each and every day. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, thank you for this time we're able to spend together. Pray that we've been able to at least give enough understanding so that we have compassion for the tempted, the hurting, the suffering, and the brokenhearted. That we might even look in our own lives and find, Lord, the solution to what we ourselves may have been struggling with for so many years. And that we might be in a position to be able to help others. Bless us this evening as we now head home, contemplating those things which we have heard. Give us a good night's rest. Prepare us on tomorrow as we shall be challenged more to look at our own selves and our mental health and how we might experience the gracious healing that you desire to give. Is our prayer in Jesus' name.
Amen.
What we can do to have brain. We're told in the book Mind, Character, and Personality, page 60, the brain is the organ and instrument of the mind and controls the whole body. In order for the other parts of the system to be healthy, the brain must be what?
Healthy.
The brain must be healthy. In other words, for the whole body to be healthy, the brain must be healthy. Now, what constitutes a healthy brain? And in order for the brain to be healthy, the blood must be pure. If by correct habits, listen to this now, if by correct habits of eating and drinking, the blood is kept pure, the brain will be properly nourished. So in order for the body to be healthy, the brain must be healthy. In order for the brain to be healthy, the blood must be pure. In order for the blood to be pure, what has to happen? According to this, you have to have what? Correct what? Correct habits of eating and drinking, then the brain will be properly nourished. So we need good nutrition in order for the brain to be nourished. Let's move it on now. There we go. In other words, we need good nutrition. And there are some of the things that we can eat in order for the brain to be healthy. This is not a comprehensive program, I'm just taking a couple minutes. But on the top left, we have almonds, which increase blood flow to the brain. Moving to the right, we have walnuts, which are high in omega-3. Also, flax seeds are high in omega-3 as well. Blueberries improve learning and motor skills, talking about the brain now. Brussels sprouts has tryptophan, which converts to serotonin in the brain. Ginger is anti-inflammatory and may help protect from brain disease. Apple power food for mind, body, and emotions. Watermelon targets brain function. Why? Because watermelon is full of water and electrolytes. And then we have cabbage, which is a cruciferous vegetable. It may lower risk of brain, lung, and prostate cancer. And cantaloupe supports the brain. Pine nuts help stimulate brain activity. Cauliflower assists in cleansing white matter in the brain. Broccoli assists in proper brain functioning. So we need good whole nutrition, plant-based foods in order for the brain to be healthy. All right? Another thing that we can utilize is turmeric. How many people know about turmeric? All right? How many of you use it? All right? It's a big thing today. They found that turmeric, some of the things that it does is helps regulate blood sugar. It's faster wound healing. And it protects against Alzheimer's, which is what? The brain, all right? The brain. It lowers inflammation. One of the biggest causes of disease today in the body and in the brain is inflammation. Inflammation. Eating a high-fat diet causes inflammation throughout the system. What type of diet, everybody? High-fat diet, all right? Eating a lot of refined foods, eating too much meat and too much fat. It causes inflammation in the system. Eating too much sugar, all right? We'll talk about that later. So we want to add some turmeric, that golden, reddish spice. Next thing we need is what? Water. We need water. Water, all right? You see that picture? All right, the brain is up to about 75% water. So therefore, we need lots of water so that our brain can be properly hydrated. And also that the body be properly hydrated. All right, how much water do we need on a daily basis?
Half of your body weight. Half of your weight.
Someone said 8 to 10, half the body weight. Now they're saying about half your body weight. So if I weigh 200 pounds, how much water do I need? You weigh 200 pounds? I don't weigh 200 pounds. But if you weigh 200 pounds, how much water do you need? 100 ounces. Half your body weight in ounces. If I weigh 150 pounds, which I'm more closer to, how much water do I need? 75 ounces. And 8 ounces of glass, how much is 75 ounces? That's about 9 glasses of water. 9 times 8 is 72. And so you see that we need lots of water to stay hydrated. Drinking water keeps your brain hydrated and helps optimize your memory and concentration. All right, another good thing to do early in the morning when you get up is to drink lemon water. All right, we talk about that some other time, but it's good to drink a warm glass of lemon water every morning. I'm gonna go back, and we're gonna deal with that this afternoon. All right, and so we just wanted to give you a few things that you can do. Make sure you eat plenty of green vegetables and certain nuts. All right, you need vitamins and minerals. My brothers and sisters, if you're not eating green vegetables, you're not getting vitamins and minerals in your diet. All right, so that is very, very important. And part 2 we do this afternoon.
It's good to be here with you. And as I said through the service, there's so many memories that are coming back from being a member of Maranatha for so many years. So it's good to be here with you. My family hopefully will be here shortly. They're not here yet, although I did see my mom. She popped in. But the rest of my family should be here shortly. So what I like to do is get right started because the time is kind of far spent already. Don't want to keep you too long. But I do want to make it worth your while by the grace of God. And so, without further ado, let us bow our heads in prayer. Dear Jesus, thank you for this wonderful time of worship and celebration, for your love and your commitment to us. We pray that as we look into your word, as we learn some things about our mental health, that the Spirit of God will guide our minds, Lord, to that which applies to us. It's my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. You know, I must say that with Elder Tate here and Pastor Giles and Elder Graves, this is like a dream church, right? Might as well just put up a tent and let's start some evangelism right now.
Amen.
Okay, so I want to take you in the Bible to Daniel chapter 1, and that's where we're going to start out, Daniel chapter 1. And I'm going to, warn you ahead of time. I'm going to do some things a little different, okay? So I don't want you to be alarmed at that, but I want to show you this. So I'm going to walk away from the mic. If you can't hear me, then let me know, and I'll come back and park it, okay? All right, so are you with me in Daniel chapter 1? Okay. I hope I don't know if you're recording or not.
We are.
You are, so I should go back to the mic. All right. Okay. Okay, so now let's read, okay? And I want to show you something that I did not see. I used to say the Bible read the same passage for over and over and over and over. Years later, you're like, wow, I never saw that. All right, so chapter 1, verse 1. The 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, into Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children of whom there was no, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were of the children of Judah. And you know who they are, right? Yes. Verse 7, they received new names. And verse 8, but Daniel did what? Purpose in his heart that he would not defile himself in the portion of the king's meat, nor the wine which he drank. So stop right there. So, when we Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Okay, let me know when you get it. Get it fixed. Okay, so when we, okay, that's not. All right. So, when we read and we study Daniel chapter 1, we talk about Daniel having purpose in his heart. We talk about the diet, right? Pulse and water, and we talk about 10 times smarter than everyone else, right? And we spend a lot of time talking about that, and rightly so, right? That temperance was in some way connected to Daniel's being really blessed, favored by God, and his longevity through both the Babylonian kingdom and even unto the Persian Empire, and rightly so. But there is another key here that for years I missed this. Years I missed this, okay? And by the way you're looking at me, I can tell you missed it too. So let's look at it together, okay? Verse 1 and verse 2 and verse 3 tell us a whole lot, right? Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and did what? Besieged it. Is that right?
Yeah.
And the Lord did what?
He
Gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, right?
Yes.
Right? The vessel of the house of God, right?
Yes.
Verse 3. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, master of his what?
Eunuchs.
Eunuchs. All right. So, walk through this with me here. All right? And let's really look at what we're talking about and how on earth did Daniel get to the point in verse 8 when he purposed in his heart, he ate the right thing and all of that. So, Nebuchadnezzar puts a siege on Jerusalem. Is that right?
Yes.
And what happens in a siege? Okay. They make it so nobody can go in and nobody can go out. Right? The purpose is so that on the inside, the people run dry of all their supplies, food and water, right? All of this. This was so bad. Go to Jeremiah chapter 4. Jeremiah chapter 4. Okay? Tell you how bad this was. In Jeremiah chapter 4, in beginning with verse 23. Okay? And I'm going to go ahead and read. And I beheld, this is Jeremiah prophesying, chapter 4, verse 23. And I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without what? Form and void. And the heavens, they had, what's that sound like? Of course that sounds like, right. And that is just because God speaks to us in the language of the past. That's his nature. That's what he does. Because he knows that that's what we can identify with. And that's all throughout Scripture. He speaks to us in the language of the past. But watch this. I beheld the mountains, and lo, they were trembled. And all the hills moved lightly. And I beheld, and lo, there was no man, and all the birds of the heavens were fled. Now, as you're reading this, automatically you're thinking, oh, this is the millennium. Okay? And certainly this is an application that you can make to the millennium, right? Which is 1,000 years when we're in heaven and Satan's here on the earth, so forth and so on. But that's not the primary interpretation of this text. You know the primary interpretation of this text, what Jeremiah is talking about? The condition which Jerusalem has been left behind as a result of the Babylonian siege. That's the primary interpretation here. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful places was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were what? Broken down. Right? At the presence of the Lord, and by his fierce anger, thus saith the Lord, thus hath the Lord said, the whole land shall be what? Desolate. Desolate. God says, yet I will not make a full end, right? For this shall the earth mourn, and the heavens above be black, so forth and so on. Go all the way down to verse 31. For I have heard a voice as of a woman in travail, and the anguish as of her that bringeth forth her first child, the voice of the daughter of Zion that bewaileth herself, that spreadeth her hands, saying, woe is me, for my soul is weary, because of what? Murderers. Have you read the book of Lamentations lately? It is about the pillage and plunder of Jerusalem. Right? In In there, Jeremiah talks about how the virgins were killed, families were separated. The women were either killed or raped. Okay? Not to mention, Jeremiah chapter 21 and verse 10. Jeremiah chapter 21, what verse did I say? 10. Verse 10. What else does the Bible tell us? Jeremiah 21 and verse 10. The Bible says, "For I have set my face against this city for evil," talking about Jerusalem, "and not for good, saith the Lord. It shall be given into the hand of the king of" who? Babylon. "And he shall" do what? "Burn it with fire." Babylon burned Jerusalem down to the ground. And we know they did a thorough job, because when you read the books of Nehemiah, right, the books of Ezra, what did they have to do? They had to build it back up. Why? Because Babylon burned it down to the ground. Commentators agree that Daniel was probably between the ages of 14 and 16 years old. His home, his school, his church burned to the ground. His parents were likely murdered. He was taken captive, right? By the way, the distance from Jerusalem to Babylon was about 1,000 miles. In between them was the hot Arabian desert. Okay? They had to walk up and around the desert just to get to Babylon. Meanwhile, the memory of his home up in smoke. Nothing would ever be the same as he once knew it. Separated from his family, right? He gets into the courts of Babylon, and guess what happens? What happens when he gets to the courts of Babylon? They make him a eunuch. They castrate him. He can never have a family, right? You know what we call that, brothers and sisters? We call that trauma. Trauma, right? He has to walk from Jerusalem to Babylon. Maybe from time to time, he gets rest, he gets a little water, he gets a little food. Here's this young man who's broken, bleeding, right? Starved, right? It's a slave in the king's service. So how does he get to the point through all of that in verse 8, it says he purposes in his heart. And here's what I missed for years. The only way that Daniel could get to that point is that he must reconcile his crisis with God. If he does not reconcile his crisis, his trauma with God, the rest of it, you never get the rest of it. The rest of it never happens. Never happens. Never happens. For years I missed that. And when I was reading one day, the Lord just brought it up to me. I said, wow, there's a young man who has been traumatized. His family is murdered. He is made a eunuch. His hometown is burned down to the ground. Right? And here he makes this decision for God. He can only do that if he first reconciles. Where's God now with all of this going on? And many people struggle, especially people who have been, who have some kind of religious orientation. They never reconcile their trauma with God. And because they never reconcile their trauma with God, they never get to the rest of the story in Daniel chapter 1. They never get there. Because their crisis, their trauma, remains a barrier between them and their faithfulness to God. See? And it's, it'll tell you, I'll read that, and it's there. It's there. It's there. In the book of Jeremiah, it talks about, I'm going to send a spirit of burning, and Jerusalem burn. And here this young man is. What is he supposed to do? How does he get through? So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what happened, what happens in our brain, what happened in his brain, right? And then we're going to talk about what happened with Jesus as well in his trauma, right? That's what we're going to end. All right, so let's see if we can. That's way if there's someone here that knows a little bit more about electronics than me. If not, I'm in trouble. Experience PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
Yes.
All right, 3 areas of the brain in which function may be altered in PTSD have been identified. 3 main areas, right? The prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. You may not be able to see as much, but I'm going to read to you. PTSD symptoms may result when a traumatic event causes an overreactive adrenaline response, which creates deep neurological patterns in the brain. These patterns can persist long after the event that triggered the fear, making an individual hyper-responsive to future fearful situations. All right? During traumatic experiences, the high levels of stress hormones secreted suppress hypothalamic activity. We'll talk about the hypothalamus and what it's responsible for, but it has to do with memory. Suppresses hypothalamic activity that may be a major factor toward the development of PTSD. So these 3 areas of the brain, prefrontal cortex, amygdala, and the hippocampus, okay? Fear from a traumatic event is left impressed upon the brain, so much so that future events that may seem similar will cause or create the same response in that individual, even if that event is not the same, right? Therefore, that person is left traumatized. All right, the amygdala, it's a little picture of the brain there. Connection with lots of areas of the brain, emotional stamping of events, increases what kind of reactions? Reflexive reaction, right? Signals sent upward are checked by what? So the prefrontal cortex that we kind of talked about last night is the filter, right? This part of the brain lets us know if things are real or not, right? You see, you're walking in the woods, you see something brown and long, right? Your reflex says what? Stay. So you jump. But a second later, your frontal lobe kicks in and says, oh, it's just a stick. You keep walking, right? So can you imagine if we didn't have this working? You'd be in trouble, right? All right. So here's a chart that kind of lets you know what each of these parts are responsible for. The hippocampus catalogs, stores and retrieves normal memory, right? When it is dysfunctional, decreased ability to form new memories. The memories are what? Fragmented, right? Trauma-related amnesia, okay? The amygdala, this is the part of the brain we talked about last night that's very prevalent as well in addiction, because this is the part of the brain that releases dopamine, right? Emotional memory, okay? Emotional memory, that's important, right? Fear conditioning. So this is a part of the brain that connects us to this fear, okay? When this is dysfunctional, increase what?
Fear.
And sensitivity to what?
Fearful.
Fearful stimuli, right? Increased reactions to triggers, enhanced traumatic what? Memories. These are dreams and flashbacks. The medial prefrontal cortex, inhibition of irrelevant stimuli, the stick versus the snake, right? Working memory, inhibition of amygdala, sustained attention. We discovered last night in addiction that it's the prefrontal cortex that has a top-down control over this amygdala area of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is the reason why we don't overreact when we get angry. The prefrontal cortex is the reason why we don't have sustained periods of anger, anxiety, and depression, right? So when this is dysfunctional, can't inhibit irrelevant stimuli. In other words, we never get to the point where we realize it's a stick. It's a stick, but we always interpret it as a what?
Snake.
As a snake. And therefore we have a reactionary response, a reflective response, like it's a snake. Now, we do that with people. We do that with people, right? When you remind me of someone in my life that traumatized me, I have a reflexive response. My brain tells me, you're a snake. No pun intended. Decrease working memory, can't inhibit emotions, increase intrusive thoughts and memories, right? Decrease attention and concentration. So, some perspective. Why is this important? Why are we talking about this? Well, because for a lot of us, we've been traumatized, and some of us in areas that we don't even realize it. Secondarily, if we're going to be relevant to the community, we're going to be brought in contact with people who have a history of trauma. So we need to know what we're dealing with. We need to understand and be able to have compassion for people who have been traumatized. Okay? It's not that they don't like you, but it's nothing to do with you, right? It has everything to do with what's not working right in their mind and in their brain. Okay? All right. Stress, right? Nobody in here experiences stress, right? Notice, it can be real or what? A real or imagined threat to physical or what? Psychological integrity of an individual. Beneficial, you know there's good stress? Yeah, they call it eustress, right? Beneficial when it is tolerable and of appropriate duration leads to feelings of mastery and development. When prolonged, right, severe or recurrent, it impairs coping abilities, okay? And there's those stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. And when stress is prolonged, these chemicals are in higher amounts in our body and they cause grave damage. Allostasis is the ability to maintain homeostasis or stability through change. This suggests the ability to anticipate stressors versus merely what? Reacting. Versus merely reacting to them. Cortex. The quality and intensity of any emotion, including anxiety, is dependent upon subjective interpretation or cognitive appraisal. That's here. Okay? Everything goes through here. The prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe is the filter. So no matter the emotion, right? We said last night that the frontal lobe has a responsibility of emotion regulation. It regulates my emotions, right? It is dependent upon subjective interpretation, cognitive appraisal of the given situation. How an individual cortically interprets the limbic mediated activity, in other words, their internal state, associated with arousal plays a major role in the subjective sense of anxiety. This here, associated with arousal, this has to do with the environment. What's happening in the environment. Another word for arousal, triggers. Triggers in the environment. Okay? All right. How many of you heard of fight or flight? Yeah. How many of you have ever been in fight or flight? Sure. We all have. The difference is, how many of us live in fight or flight? The person who has PTSD lives in fight or flight. Okay? If a lion came through this room right now, we'd all be in fight or flight. Right? And chances are there would be more flight than fight. Right? So this is a response that many people live in. So notice, state of high alert. Okay, you may know some people like this. They're always on alert. Okay, they're in a state of action, not thought. At that point in fight or flight, you're not critically thinking. A lion enters the room, it's not time to think, it's time to run. Right? Inability to think clearly. The thoughts are what? Extreme. So, in our church, not far from here in Willoughby, one of our ministries is ministering to people who have mental illness. This was not an organic ministry, but we noticed that we kept and keep getting people who struggle with mental illness. And so what happens is these individuals will come to conclusions about things about members that were way beyond truth. Where is this coming from, right? So it's only as we started kind of studying and learning about, mental illness, we begin to realize that, oh, this has nothing to do with the failings of the church. This is about the individual and our inability to really understand, right, what those individuals are experiencing. So these folks have extreme thoughts. In a state of hypervigilance, hypervigilance means you're high alert all the time. You're on edge all the time, and with everybody, okay? Attention to threat, even things that you perceive to be a threat, but they're not really a threat. But in your mind, your brain says this is a threat. Your brain says this is a snake. You gotta watch out, you gotta be careful, right? Intense and prolonged, what? Anxiety. Yes, and a drive to action. These are the different ways that we have a physiological response to fight or flight. This further validates the fact that our thoughts influence our biology. We learned last night that the way we think, our attitude can actually change our brain, right?
Yeah.
Dr. Wes Youngberg, in his book, When Wellness, talks about psychoneuroimmunology, right? That's a long, fancy word that just means that our mental state and condition can have an impact on our central nervous system and our immune system, right? Isn't that interesting? In the book, Mind, Character, and Personality, Ellen White says that many people would be well if they only think themselves worse, right? And the converse is also true, right? Okay. Stress leads to damage to the neuroreceptors that control the stress response. It increases the receptors for cortisol, we talked about that, with the result that it is easier to be triggered, right? And then we talk about this. Chronically high levels of cortisol and adrenaline, of course, are very damaging as well. Adrenaline is good if you're about to play sports or something like that, but when you're trying to sit in church and listen to a sermon, or when you're trying to go to sleep at night, you don't really need adrenaline. But if you're not well, right, and your brain operates so that it interprets everything as a threat, you have hypervigilance. You walk around all day with a high level of adrenaline in your system. So you can't sleep, you can't even digest food, right? A lion comes in here, you're not thinking, oh, it's time to eat, right? So you have stomach problems, right? You have all kinds of issues because you're so hyped up on adrenaline. You're on high alert all the time. So it's very damaging, right? Try to form relationships with people who suffer from this becomes very difficult, right? Because they overreact, right? And they interpret things in an extreme way that you didn't mean that. That wasn't what you meant at all, right? Right. All right. So the medial prefrontal cortex, you can see here just as another image of how these things are very closely related here. All right, the amygdala is part of our threat system. Its job is to keep us safe by alerting us, to danger. It does this by setting off an alarm in our body, by triggering the fight or flight response. It gets us ready to act. So that's its job. Unfortunately, it isn't very good at discriminating between real dangers out there. Why? Because that's the job of what? That's the job of the frontal lobe. That's right. It isn't good at discriminating between real dangers out there or dangers that we are just thinking about. Isn't that interesting? That you can have a fight or flight response just on a imagined danger, right? And also, television, action movies. They're real or imagined? Yeah, but your brain and your body have a response as if it's real. That's why, when you're watching the excitement, when you're watching the chase, your heart actually starts beating a little faster. You're on the edge of your seat, right? Your eyes start to bulge a little bit, right? I sound like I'm talking from experience, don't we? All right. Listen, I grew up watching WWF wrestling. Just pray for me on that. Okay. So this means that it can set the alarm off when we are thinking about an unpleasant memory from the past, even though the danger has passed. Right? The hippocampus. It helps us to store and remember information. It's like a librarian, and it tags our memories with information about where and when they occurred. But watch this. When our threat system is active, the hippocampus doesn't work so well. It can forget to tag the memories with time and place information, which means they sometimes get stored in the wrong place. When we remember them, it can feel like they are happening again. So the hippocampus is not working so well because of this hypervigilant state. Memories and experiences from the past can accidentally get stored as if it is occurring when? Now. Right? Now. PTSD displays biochemical changes in the brain and body, which are different from other psychiatric disorders such as major depression. In a study using combat-related slides and sounds to provoke PTSD symptoms, combat veterans with PTSD had an increased blood flow in the area of the medial prefrontal cortex. Okay, so these memories here, okay, and of course, you know, we associate. I noticed in my history of working with the sick and suffering that these individuals have the same response behaviorally. People who have been in combat and people who have been in prison for like 20, 25 years. I noticed that they have the same type of behavior. And I realized, I started connecting the dots, you know, the more and more of these individuals that I see and I spoke to, because when you are in prison, we're not talking about jail, we're talking about penitentiary, that's different from jail, right? And you've been there for 20, 25 years, you know, it's almost like a combat zone. You have to stay on high alert, right? And so these individuals were coming out, and they were very, very guarded. They talked very little, okay? They were always to themselves. This was survival mechanism, okay? This was the defense mechanism that was necessary for them to survive. The problem is that they weren't in combat zone anymore. They weren't in the penitentiary anymore, right? But they still held on to these survival tactics and behaviors, right? The brain, it's like the brain could never catch up and never process the fact that, hey, there's no danger here. You're okay, you're home now, right? We'll just read the first part of this. The amygdala, the key brain region in the processing, interpreting, and integration of emotional functioning. The amygdala is where what? Fear is what? Learned from past experience and is what? Permanently stored. Permanently stored. Listen, this is why Jesus has to come.
Yes.
There are some damages that sin has brought that we will never get rid of. Jesus has to remove it. You have to take it away, right? More about fight or flight. When a threat can be conquered, we choose to what? Fight. Okay? What are the observable evidences that we're in fight? What is posturing? What is posturing? Yeah. You know? Right? You ready to stop somebody? What you said? What? Right? Verbal what? Outbursts or right? What else? Confrontation. Right? Confrontation. That is someone who is looking for a fight. Right? Physical aggression. What about flight? When a threat can be avoided, doing what? Yeah, this is the lion coming in the building, and I'm out of here. right? Disassociation. Now this is interesting because disassociation means that you disconnect yourself from your environment. Okay? You lose focus and attention of what's happening around you. You disassociate. It's like you're here, but you're not really here. That is oftentimes a survival mechanism, by the way. Individuals who have a mental health diagnosis of schizophrenia oftentimes do this, and you'll oftentimes see them periodically disassociate, right? Hiding. There are a lot of ways to hide. You can physically hide, right? You can mental and emotionally hide, right? Just choosing not to deal with things. People around you are saying, what's wrong with you? Why don't you? You just don't. Shrinking in posture, right? And what else? Tone of voice. More, submit when a threat can be what? Mitigated, right? If you can't beat them, do what? Join them. Can't beat them, join them. Self-harm, I have to watch this, especially in young people. Okay? When this is happening, when they're self-harming, cutting themselves, self-harm isn't for the purpose of trying to kill themselves. Okay? People who self-harm, their cuts will be surface. It'll be enough to bleed, but they're not cutting the wrist. They will cut up here, or they will cut in other places that you can't see. Okay? And this may be why. You know, it's not changing. Oh well. Instigating? What? Yeah. And defending the attacker. You see this a lot of times in domestic violence situations, right? You know, supposed to go to court, testify, you don't show up to court. Why? Somebody confronts you, hey, you know, why you allow him or you allow her to do X, Y, and Z, and you know, they're really a good person. You know, you just don't know. They're really defending the attacker. That's when a threat can be mitigated. Okay? And then of course there's this response. There's no way to avoid the harm. Complete helplessness. Okay? Physical freezing. A stupor-like state. Right? Catatonia is similar to the stupor-like state. Okay? So these are responses that is in the sphere of flight or flight. Okay? A little bit more. Hypersensitivity to minor threats. We talked about that. Extremist thinking. We talked about that. Respond to many things as a threat to life, aggression, and impulse control. Attention to threat while ignoring less threatening, but what? Important information. You didn't even hear the sermon. You caught up on the fact that that sister didn't even speak to you. Pastor preached a powerful word. It applies to your life. And you steam, you sitting there brooding. Right? Listen, this stuff happens. It happens. It happens. It's your brain not working right. Okay? So, less threatening but important information is being disseminated and you're not catching it. Okay, listen to this. It is exhausting to view the entire world as a potential threat. Right? Can you imagine having to walk around watching your back all the time? Not just physically, mentally, and emotionally. Somebody's always out to get you. Somebody's always trying to. You know anybody like that? Somebody's always out to get them. It doesn't matter where they are. Somebody's always out to get them. Right? It takes a great deal of energy to remain vigilant and on guard. And so oftentimes a person who lives in this hypervigilant state have a period of complete exhaustion. Also, why they might prefer to simply be alone. Because people are the threat. People are the threat. Okay? People are the threat. So this is not just a person that's just not social. People are the threat. Right? So you have to take a look at that. More about hypervigilance, the experience of being constantly tense and on guard. Your brain is on high alert in order to be certain danger is not near. This state is of increased awareness, anxiety, and sensitivity to the environment around you often manifests as a need to always scan your surroundings, right, for potential what? Right? With the brain resources on constant alert, the result can be inappropriate or even aggressive reactions to what?
Everyday situations.
Yeah. You're blowing up over little things.
Right.
Things that at the end of the day don't really mean that much. Right? But you take it overboard. The continual need to do what? Assess people. Why you got to assess? Why you got? I need to get to know her. I need to get to know him. I need to see what they're about. Why? Right? In order to protect oneself from any further harm or reduce what? The harm coming. You ever seen people, you know, it's something, I don't like something about them. I don't know. I don't like them. You don't even know their name. What you don't like about it? It's just something. You know, what vibe? What are you talking about? Right? This hypervigilance often continues on well after the abuse and danger have ceased. Okay? How about suspiciousness? We have people in church like that. It can feel like you're waiting for the betrayal, watching the other person, looking for clues in order to what? Because it's going to happen. It's going to happen. However, some people are not prepared to wait for the betrayal and may end and otherwise what? Healthy relationship. I just stopped talking to them. Well, why? What they do? I don't know. Just something went right. I just stopped talking. Okay. All right. All right. Paranoia. A tendency to overestimate the potential for danger at any given moment. Catastrophizing. The old folks used to say, you making a mountain out of a molehill, right? Our minds to take a current situation and give it an extremely negative spin, allowing it to take us down all sorts of roads of worry and what ifs. This in turn can create many more negative situations. So the tendency to catastrophize. All right? Principles of neurodevelopment. The brain is underdeveloped when? At birth. The brain organizes from what? All right, we'll see what that means in just a moment. Okay? Brain stem to cortex. And from the what?
Inside out.
The inside out. Excellent. Organization and functional capacity of the neural system is sequential, right? There is an order there. Experiences do not have equal, okay, listen to this. Experiences do not have equal influences throughout development. Okay? So what are we saying here? Here's what we're saying. We're saying in the earlier stages of development, when you experience trauma, like Daniel did, at 14 and 16 years old, or for some of us, sexual abuse at age 5, the brain takes the earlier trauma as the more intense trauma. Even if later on in life you experience something that is more traumatizing, the brain continues to respond off the earlier trauma and will treat the earlier trauma as the worst trauma. You understand what I'm saying? So this is the danger of childhood trauma, because the child becomes an adult, and the adult continues to have a reflex, right, from an earlier trauma that they never dealt with. Sexual abuse, domestic violence, right? They never dealt with betrayal, abandonment, neglect. They never dealt with that as a kid. Didn't even know how to. Now they're an adult and wondering why they can't sustain a healthy relationship. They never dealt with her. Let me say this, brothers and sisters. I love you, okay? And I'll say this in love. Don't be too religious to go get you some help.
Amen.
I don't know what it is about many church folk that, you know, the Lord gonna deal. Yes, the Lord gonna deal with it as you go see somebody. I like what the elder said this morning. You know, prayer is wonderful.
Yes.
Okay? But even the Bible teaches that prayer alone, by itself, won't get you any results.
Amen.
Go see somebody. It's okay to do that. Even the Bible says, in a multitude of counselors there is wisdom. Sometimes we need to hear ourselves talk.
Yes.
Right? We need somebody to be a sounding board. So don't be afraid to go and get you a psychiatrist or a psychologist,
Yes.
a mental health person. Just talk, just see what's there. Listen, I grew up off 131st there. Okay, my mom stayed on the top end towards 116. My father stayed on the 93rd end. Okay, toward 93rd. You know, it wasn't nothing but young people getting shot and killed and all that. But at the time, if you would have asked me if that was traumatic, what do you think I would have said? No, it ain't traumatic. That's just what it is. You know, hey man, you know Johnny Wright did right. Well, yeah, man, he got killed. I said, for real? Yeah, man, they found him right. Oh, dang. Hey man, what you want from the store? Right? And we move on. Like that's just how it happened. Okay? But as I became trained and professional, I realized that, man, that wasn't normal.
Yes.
Wasn't that normal about that? Was very abnormal. But I accepted the abnormal for the normal. That was, listen, my first memory, my very first memory as a child, the very first one, I was 4 years old. I remember it like it was yesterday. I have accepted the fact that until Jesus comes, I will never shed the memory of this. Okay? I was at home at 93rd with my father and my mom. Okay? My mom is studying a book at the table. Okay? I run up to her. She shoos me away. My father gets up and hits my mother in the head and bursts her head open. There's blood gushing. He picks up, he takes her and rushes her to the sink to wash the blood off. I'm under her looking like this. That's my first memory in life. I'll never get rid of that. Never. It's there. It's there. And if you look on my mom, you can see right here, you can still see that gash. It's there. That's my first, not just trouble. Beautiful mom, I love you. You know I do. But that's my first memory. I was 4 years old. What was I supposed to take? How was I supposed to digest that? Nobody ever talked to me about that. Nobody ever said, son, you know what I did was wrong. I'm so sorry. So my father is a different man today, my biological father, but that's what he did to my mom. And I saw that. And that affected me, right? And so as time went on, you know, I had responses and triggers, you know, because of that. You know, I oftentimes wonder why. I was still upset that my mom and dad were never together, never got married. You know, what's going on? You know, but I remember that, and I will always remember that. Okay. So my point is that the earlier trauma, the brain will save that and store it as the more intense trauma. And as an adult, without help and without healing, the adult victim will continue to have a reflexive response as if that earlier trauma is present, right? So the brain develops from the bottom up, right? Inside out, motor regulation, balance, heart rate, breathing, right? Midbrain, attachment, context memory, sexual behavior, emotion reactivity, appetite, satiety, which means being satisfied, blood pressure and body temperature, and then notice the last thing that's developed. The last thing is what?
Wow.
Yes, that frontal cortex, that frontal lobe, abstract thought, logic, and reason. So it makes sense because by the time the part of my brain develops that says, hey, wait a minute, this is real, this is not, this is why, right? Right and wrong, reason, and all of that. By the time that comes, I didn't already have the trauma. I didn't already had it. That part of my brain wasn't even developed enough to digest that. So of course my brain is going to have a response based off of that earlier trauma as if it is the more intense trauma. Right? The part of my brain that I needed to help me to work through that wasn't even developed, wasn't there. I was 4. Right? So, all right. Now my wife will tell you my brain is still developing. Resilience. Any analogy of resilience, or an analogy of resilience is a rubber band or band. When hit by an object, rubber may be stressed, bent, but it can do what? Bounce back to its original shape and position. Over time, right? Rubber can also be what? Molded to change its original shape and position, keeping some aspects and improving others. It is defined as the ability to adapt well to what? How adaptable have you learned to be in life? How adaptable have you learned? Sometimes it's tough, isn't it? Because this world, it's a wicked world, right? This world is something else because of sin. There's a lot, if we live long enough, there's a lot that we're going to go through. Amen. Inside and out. Amen. And without resilience, now here's the great thing. The good thing is that even in older age, you can enhance your resiliency. Amen. Maybe we'll talk more about that this afternoon. You can enhance your resiliency factors, okay? We'll talk about that. All right. Now, I'm going to close with this. We're going to close with this. Go with me to 1 John chapter 4. 1 John chapter 4. And we want to look at verse 18. 1 John 4:18. Amen. If you are not familiar, I would encourage you to look up and or get the book by Dr. Andrew Newberg. It's called How God Changes Your Brain. He is Jewish, but he is a neuroscientist. Dr. Andrew Newberg, How God Changes Your Brain. He did a study that is world renowned. His study was on the impact of spirituality and the brain. His study showed that an individual who have been traumatized, if they will spend time praying, meditating, and engaging themselves in other religious activity, but especially this, if they will spend time concentrating and focusing on the love of God. Yes. They found, the research showed through brain imaging, the research showed that the love of God and focusing and concentrating on this aspect will actually tame the amygdala. It will both stimulate the prefrontal cortex while at the same time taming the amygdala. Now, why is that important? Because with PTSD, the amygdala, right, is responsible for the fear response. Now, Dr. Newberg, bless his heart, I'm grateful for his research, but this is not new, right? This is not new. Why? Because of 1 John 4:18. Look at what it says. All right, there? Here it says, amen, valid. There is no fear in what? But perfect love does what? What does it do to fear? Cast it out. Yes. Right? Cast out fear, because fear hath what? Torment. What's that torment? Well, we just studied about that torment, right? This hypervigilance, this suspiciousness, this on edge. That's the torment. This response to stress that literally rips down and tears down your immune system, cause you to be exhausted, cause you to have damaged relationships, right? That's the torment right there. We can't live a healthy, satisfying life, right? There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear hath torment. He that feareth is not made perfect in what? In love. In love. How deep and how broad is the love of God? How deep and how broad is the love of God? Go read the book of Ephesians. Ephesians, and let's look very briefly, very quickly, at Ephesians chapter 3, verse 17 through 19. Are you there? Yes. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 17 through 19. Look what the Bible says. That Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye being rooted and grounded in what? Love. Watch this. May be able to what? Comprehend. With all saints. What is the? Breadth and to know the love of Christ, which what? Passes knowledge, that ye might be what? Filled with all the fullness of God. All right, so listen here. The love of God is so broad. It is so deep. It is so infinite. It is beyond our understanding. It is also beyond any fear that you and I can ever experience because of sin. Amen. Okay? We cannot have so much fear that the love of God cannot cover it. Amen. But in fact, if we focus and concentrate and learn and understand, if we breathe and eat the love of God, that amygdala, that fear, has no match, is no match for the love of God, and we will live in peace. Ellen White says in the book Mind, Character, and Personality that the love of God will invigorate the entire system. It will energize every part of our being. That's the love of God. That's the love of God. It is too broad. It is too deep. When we get to eternity, we will still be learning and trying to comprehend the love of God. It is infinite because He is infinite. We cannot exhaust the love of God. It can never be exhausted. That's why the Bible says in 1 John 4:8, God is love. God is love. All right, we got to close here. Let's talk about Jesus. Consider the trauma history of Jesus. Right? From the manger to the cross. As a child, Herod saw his life. Right? Which is very interesting because we know now something called prenatal influence. Right? As a child, Herod saw his life. He was born among the animals because there was no woman to eat. His brothers and sisters doubted that he was the Messiah and often gave him a hard time. Not only this, but the Bible says in John 11 that he came to his own, and his own what? He was despised, the Bible says, and rejected. Isaiah 53 tells us he was a man of what? Sorrow. Acquainted with what? Grief. Acquainted with grief. And then it says, and we esteem him not. He was betrayed by his most trusted friends, his disciples, brutally beaten, called names, spit on, even by his own church family. Now, consider Jesus hanging on the cross. Alienated, seemingly deserted. In the most critical time of his life, the worst crisis he has ever faced, it seems that God, his confidant, is not there. He is human, therefore his amygdala is screaming out for the mastery. Trying to tempt him to be overcome with fear and with doubt. The instinctual part of his brain wants to take over. The instinctual part of his brain wants to take over. It says he's human. He has adopted us, right? He's one of us. He's human. He's in this situation. So his brain very naturally, his amygdala very naturally sees around fear. Fear. Right? Fear. What does he do? What are his reactions? More importantly, what are his conditioned responses in his moment of crisis? Well, in Matthew 27:34, they offered him vinegar. He says, no. In Luke chapter 23, let's look at Luke chapter 23. This is the last chapter here that we'll look at. The book of Luke chapter 23, verses 43. Luke 23, verse 43. to the thief on the cross. His response is, verily I say unto thee, today thou shalt be with me in what? Paradise. Verses 43 and 46 of the same chapter. 46, Luke 23, 46. And when Jesus cried with a loud voice, he said, Father, into my hands I what? Now you say, but wait a minute. Didn't the Bible say, and after he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?
Yes.
Okay. That is from Psalms 22, is it not? In Hebrew, it is a Hebrew custom that, of course, you know, the book of Psalms is nothing but a book of prayers and songs, right? Psalms 22 is one such prayer of supplication. In Hebrew thought and in Hebrew culture, you do not have to repeat the entire passage in order to claim the promise in the passage. All you have to do is repeat the first line.
Wow.
The end of Psalms 22 is a song of praise and rejoicing and one of victory. So when Jesus says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He does not say that because he lacks faith. He does not say that because he is bewildered and confused. He says that to reaffirm his identity in the Father.
Wow.
It is his conditioned response.
All right, all right.
Ellen White says in the book Desire of Ages that on the cross, with no visible evidence of the Father's love, the only thing that he could go on is his former encounters with the Father, his former experiences with the Father. And that's what he held on to. It was his conditioned response. So that in a moment of crisis, his instinctive brain, the amygdala, cannot find the mastery. It remains subject to his prefrontal cortex that tells him, you are the Father's child.
All right.
And you will be resurrected beyond the grave. That's why he could say to the thief on the cross, verily, verily, I say unto you that you will be with me in paradise.
Amen.
Don't you want a response like that?
Yes.
Crisis.
Yes.
The Bible tells us in Philippians 2:5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ. That's what I want. Amen.
Amen.
Let's pray to that end together. Father in heaven, in Jesus' name we come before you. And Lord, we admit that we don't always respond to our crisis in the way that we should. We stumble and we make mistakes, Lord, and we overreact and we are aggressive sometimes when we shouldn't be, and we take small things and make them big things, and we're often paranoid and suspicious, and we blow things out of proportion. And Lord, we're just a mess sometimes. But Father, we see that we don't have the capacity on our own to deal with ourselves. We see that you went through what you went through so that you could help us. And so, Lord, we confess we need your help. We need your mind. We need to know the love of God beyond knowledge. A love that calms the instinctive part of our brain. A love that lets us know that despite the crisis, despite the turmoil, despite the chaos that is surrounding our life, we are your child. We are fulfilling your purpose, and that you have a destiny for us beyond the stars. That this world is not our home. We are pilgrims. We are strangers that is passing through. Oh Lord, may we be rooted and grounded in such love today. It's my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
I'm a little bit of it earlier, but I got caught up with some banana pudding. And I did take the bananas out.
You take them out? Oh, good.
Well, I did take them out, but
Good for you. I told you.
let's begin with prayer. Merciful God, that was so very grateful for your presentation that was given this morning, notwithstanding the one last night, we have been enlightened, our minds have been illuminated. We see the wonder of what you have done for us, and Lord, what we must do for ourselves as well. Now, as we prepare to hear more, prepare our hearts to receive it. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
What do you say? We sing one song before we get started.
Okay.
Getting instructions. Anybody has a favorite? Will we all get to heaven? Thank you. I'll pick that.
Yes.
When we all get to heaven.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus. Sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansion bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Onward to the prize before us, soon its beauty will behold. Soon the pearly gates will open, we shall tread the streets of gold. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory.
Now, I have to sing that song. I haven't sung that song. I want you to do me a favor very seriously. I believe heaven is very soon before us. Would you do me the favor, when you get there, look for me?
Amen.
I look for you.
Yes. We'll think about
We talked about you the other day. In prayer meeting, we said there will be those who get all dressed up in their white uniforms, their wings, and the elevator will say, "You're going down." I really believe this, folks. I really believe this on my heart. If you're not thinking about heaven often, it's probably because you're not going. If you're not thinking about heaven often, it's probably because you're not going. Think about it, because many of us, most of us, yeah, I pray all of us, go there. Again, we just want to welcome our guest speaker today. Very, very insightful, very practical information he's giving us. Useful for today and for the future, and for those of us. We welcome again Paster Conway. Pastor Conway.
Before Pastor Conway comes, I want to do a little part two this morning when we talked about brain health. All right? And this morning the brain is the organ and instrument of the mind. The brain is the physical, and the mind is the spiritual and material. And the brain controls the whole body. In order for the other parts of the system to be healthy, the brain must be healthy. And in order for the brain to be healthy, the blood must be pure. If by correct habits of eating and drinking, the blood is kept pure, the brain will be properly nourished. And so in order to have a healthy brain, we must have pure blood. In order to have pure blood, we must have correct habits of eating and drinking. Because a clogged stomach means a clogged brain. And we talked about this morning some certain foods that we need to get in order to have a healthy brain. We need plant-based foods, we need green foods, and blueberries and walnuts and ginger. We also talked about turmeric. Turmeric is an anti-inflammatory. In the book of Deuteronomy, I believe it's chapter 30, chapter 28, where it talks about blessings and curses. And one of the curses is God says, I will smite you with inflammation. And so when we don't follow God's health principles, inflammation sets in the system, and which is caused by a high-fat diet, basically, eating a lot of refined foods, and it causes inflammation in the system, which also hinders the brain. And so turmeric is good, it's anti-inflammatory, it protects against Alzheimer's, which is a brain disease. Then we talked about we need water, right? And so we need plenty of water. Anybody remember how much water we need? Half your body weight in ounces. Half your body weight in ounces. So if you weigh 120 pounds, how many ounces of water do you need? 60 ounces. You need 60 ounces of water. If you weigh 200 pounds, how much water do you need? 100 ounces. All right. And so the brain is composed of almost 75% water. Drinking water keeps your brain hydrated and helps optimize your memory and concentration. Now, one of the things we don't need, pay attention everybody, the one thing we don't need is too much sugar in the system. Too much what, everybody? Sugar. We do not need too much sugar in the system. When we get too much sugar, and we eat a lot of sugar, you can become addicted to sugar. You can become what, everybody? Addicted. You can become addicted to sugar. Anybody here addicted? Don't raise your hand. No. And Pastor Conway has been talking about addiction. He talked about that last night. Eating too much sugar regularly can cause addiction. And that's the brain, that red, that's the brain in the scan. It shows what the brain looks like when you're addicted to sugar. Not only that, sugar is addictive as cocaine. And you see the brain scan of someone who eats a lot of sugar, who has a sugar addiction, and the brain of someone who's on cocaine. They almost look alike, don't they? Yes. Is that what you're doing? And so, in order to have a healthy brain, we need to stay away from eating too much sugar. Now, I didn't say that it's bad to have a little banana pudding on salad. That's not what I said. That's not what I said. It's not bad to have a little cream over your rice cake on salad. But we're talking about eating too much sugar, all right, and consuming too much sugar. You have to know that for yourself. But remember this, sugar is in everything. Yes. I have a book. It's called Salt, Sugar, and Fat. And the author shows that the food industry deliberately puts so much salt, sugar, and fat in foods to cause addiction. That's why you love those Fritos. That's why you love eating this and you love eating that, because they purposely and intentionally put so much salt, sugar, and fat in a certain amount to cause addiction. And so we don't want to be addicted to anything. All right, the book is called Salt, Sugar, and Fat by Michael Moss. I only got a couple more minutes here. I love the way Pastor Conway ended the message this morning. What did he end on?
On Jesus Christ.
On Christ. But he also ended on what type of, I'm going to say, what type of gift or fruit of the Spirit did he end on?
Love.
Love. He ended on love, didn't he?
Yeah.
And while he was talking, I said, Lord have mercy. Now, him and I didn't compare notes, but as we get ready to close, you're going to see that. Just as we close. Sugar addiction. People can become, this is taken from the book Living Free, page 61. People can become overly dependent on sweet food. The brain is getting addicted to its own opioids, as it would morphine or heroin. Drugs give a bigger effect, but it's essentially the same process. Highly palatable foods such as sugar and highly potent sexual stimuli are the only stimuli capable of activating activating the dopamine system with anywhere near the potency of addictive drugs. And those of you who were here last night, you understand what that means. He talked about dopamine.
Yeah.
So eating a whole lot of sugar and highly potent sexual stimuli almost has the same result as drugs.
Wow.
Now, what do we mean by highly potent sexual stimuli? Pornography, highly potent stimuli, sexual stimuli. Pornography, sexual perversion, those are highly stimulating, and it has the same effect on the brain as does drugs. And now they're thinking that sugar consumption, high sugar consumption, may contribute to Alzheimer's disease. And also, they're thinking that Alzheimer's is what you call type 3 diabetes. Diabetes of the brain. By eating too much sugar. You see it there. All right, so in order to have a healthy brain, don't consume too much sugar refined foods. All right? Now, what else do we need? We're going to close on this. The one thing we need, my brothers and sisters, well, I'm not there yet. We need to walk also to stimulate our brains. All right? Walking.
Amen.
We need much rest and sleep. Give your brain rest and do better on a test. Sleep helps your brain process new information, making it easier to remember. Give your brain a rest. Sleep 8 hours a night before at night you do best. Now, lastly, to help your brain, we need to do what?
Good for
We need
others.
to do good for
I did
others.
something to where it just
We
doesn't
need to do
stabilize so
good
much on.
for others.
Is if
What does that do for
like if
us?
I let it go, it'll do this. Like
In the
it'll
book,
mess.
My Life Today,
Sink
page
backwards.
246,
I don't know what I did.
it says, if thou clothe the naked and bring the poor to your house, and deal your bread to the hungry, then shall thy light break forth as the morning,
I tried
and
to,
your
I tried to
health
tighten that
shall
up and that
spring
didn't do it.
forth speedily. So when you do good for others, when you clothe the naked, when you bring the poor, and you help the poor, what will happen? Your health shall spring forth speedily. Then it goes on to say, doing good is an excellent remedy for disease. Now watch this. The pleasure of doing good to others imparts a glow to the feelings, which flashes through the nerves, quickens the circulation of the blood, and induces mental and physical health. Did y'all hear that? So when you do good, it has a mental and physiological effect on your health. It increases the circulation. It induces mental and physical health. Many of us are crying out to God, Lord, I'm unhappy. Lord, I'm suffering. I got depression. I'm anxious. My brothers and sisters, ask the Lord to put somebody in your way to do good for other
Oh,
people.
there it is.
Amen.
We're always looking for something to come to us, but the Bible, a
Deacon
principle in
Robinson
the
to the
Bible is
rescue.
you receive by doing what? By giving. You receive by giving.
All right. Ingenuity.
Now lastly, I'm still getting there. The doing of works of mercy and love. Mercy on what, everybody?
Love.
It opens the windows of the soul heavenward, letting in the sunshine of God's love. With it, that is God's love, comes serenity and composure. Physical, mental, and moral strength increase. Because the atmosphere of heaven as a living, active agency fills it. So my brothers and sisters, what we're saying, and as Pastor Conway ended on, I didn't see his notes. We need the love of God in our hearts.
Amen.
We need the love of God. We need to experience the unconditional love of God.
Yes.
Did you know that many of the things that we do and the habits that we have is because we do not experience the love of God? The love of God makes you whole. So when we eat and when we drink and when we watch and we do different things, it's because we don't feel whole. And we're using the things of this world to try to make us whole because we're not experiencing the love of God. Now watch what it says. Pastor Conway quoted a little bit of it, but in My Life Today, page 155, and also is found in Mind, Character, and Personality. Listen to this. The love which Christ diffuses through the whole being is a vitalizing power. Every vital part, the brain, the heart, the nerves, it does what?
Touches with healing.
The love of God touches your brain, your heart, your nerves with healing. By it, that is by the love of Christ, the highest energies of the being are aroused to activity. Yet the love of Christ frees the soul from the guilt, the sorrow, the anxiety, and care that do what?
Crush the life force.
So all of these are issues, negative emotions, such as guilt, sorrow, anxiety, and care. They crush the life forces. But when we experience the love of Jesus, and we give love to others, my brothers and sisters, with it comes serenity and composure. It implants in the soul joy that nothing earthly can destroy. Joy in the Holy Spirit, health-giving, life-giving joy.
Amen.
So you want to have a good brain and good, healthy emotions? Ask the Lord to come into your life and fill you with the love of Jesus. And ask the Lord, Lord, help me to be able to love other people.
Yeah.
We learned this morning there is no fear in love. So we cannot be afraid to love other people and be afraid to allow others to love us.
Amen.
All right, we're going to let Pastor Conway come on.
Amen. Amen.
See the people up there. When you done missed it, did you see that one?
Okay, you're being passed out a depression test that I'd like you to take a few moments to fill out. And I do not want you to share it. It's only for you, okay? And it's not for, well, if you're 13 and up, then it should be right. Yeah. So that is just for you. It's just for you. Huh? No, I'd like you to go ahead and do it now. Yes, I'd like you to do it now. Just to the best of your ability. Nobody will see this. You don't need to put your name on it or anything like that. You just need to be as honest as you know how yourself, and we'll go from there. So I want to thank Elder Graves. As he mentioned, we did not confer notes, but he is my father in the ministry, so he certainly confirmed a lot of what we've already heard. Pen? One pen. Okay. Well, I forgot to mention, don't take one to give to somebody else that's not here either. Okay. Don't do that. Okay. eyes only. So when you finish, feel free to fold it up, put it away. Yes, go ahead and score yourself at the bottom. So as it says on the bottom, this paper is certainly not to take the place of a professional psychiatric or mental health evaluation. But make no mistake about it, the questions that they're being is being presented on the paper are the exact questions that you would be asked in different ways. Same questions that are used to diagnose what we call clinical depression. Okay, we will talk about clinical depression and what we call situational depression. So let me be clear about this presentation, this brief presentation here. So I am a depression and anxiety recovery program coach. Okay, it is a community-based program that supports and advocates for the treatment of depression and anxiety through lifestyle change. Okay, so I just want to be clear about that. And this is the angle that I will be coming from today, and I'll show you that program as well. Thank you for your willingness to participate in the little survey there. Let's get started with some stats in regards to suicide, right? 1.5 million people per year attempt suicide. Less than 10% succeed. It's very interesting. People are generally surprised when they find that someone close to them have attempted suicide. You know what their response usually is? I mean, they didn't seem like they were sad. Everything looked okay the last time I seen them, right? And then you find out they attempted suicide. The severely depressed, obviously, are at higher risk. Adolescents, and the elderly are at high risk. Okay? I guess it would help if I turned it on and plug it in. All right. Suicide is the 8th leading cause of death in the U.S. In fact, very interesting, just last year, I was at the church. You can see it right off of 90 going west, big old church. I used to ride by that church and wonder, like, man, I bet it's nice in there. Sure enough, it was beautiful. Anyway, I was there presenting and found that the pastor of the church was hosting Suicide Prevention Day. And he got up and told his story about their son and how their son had committed suicide. They had no idea that their son was depressed or going through things. The next thing you know, the son committed suicide. Of course, you know, he's pastor of a church, nice big church, son commits suicide. And what do parents quite naturally do? They start looking to themselves, like, what did we do or what didn't we do? And he talked about how there was a real crisis in the life of himself as well as his wife. Which is interesting. The research shows that couples who lose a child very rarely stay together. So that was an interesting thing. 4th leading cause of death between the ages of 10 and 15. Okay? These are our kids that we're talking about. Our kids are trying to take their life. Yeah, 10 and 15. What are you trying to kill yourself? Why? What's going on? Right? I was talking to somebody earlier. It's a different world than it was even when I was 10 or 15 years old. It's a different world, completely. 3rd leading cause of death between the ages of 15 and 25. More firearm-related fatalities result from suicide than homicide. Did you know that? Usually when you hear about that, you think somebody shot somebody else, but most of the gun violence is related to suicide more so than homicide. Hmm? The risk of suicide increases when depression is not treated adequately. You know, though it used to be a time where people felt and just know that, hey, you know, just something I'm going through, just a phase I'm going through. What we're saying here is that if you have depression, depression will not get better over time without treatment. Okay? It's not a phase. It doesn't gradually get better. In fact, quite the opposite. It gradually gets worse, especially without treatment. Okay? All right. Let's talk about the risk factors. There are 14 risk factors for suicide. Number 1, being a man. Men are 16 times more likely to commit suicide. Right? Men. Yes, sir.
These 16 times more likely to attempt or to actually
Complete. Women are actually more likely to attempt. Men are more likely to actually do it and go through it. You know, I tell, when I'm talking to young guys, I always tell them, it's not a coincidence that women outlive men. It's not a coincidence. What we do as men when it comes to emotional problems, so you know what we do? We go to work. And we work ourselves to death. Women are more likely to reach out to their social peers and support. They're more likely to talk. They're more likely to go and seek help. Man, honey, you need some help. I don't need no help. You need to talk to nobody. Okay, go right on ahead. Die early. And that's what we do. That's what we do. Rather than talk and share and go get help. Various mental illnesses, obviously. How about alcohol and drug abuse? A large number of suicides are alcohol and drug related. A football player a couple of years ago for the Kansas City Chiefs who committed suicide in the parking lot of the facility was under the influence of alcohol. Okay? It's there. Why? Because what do we know about alcohol? Or any other drugs? What does it do? Well, first of all, alcohol in small doses is a stimulant, but in larger doses, it acts as a depressant. But it's what we call a mind or mood altering chemical. Anything to alter the mind, not thinking straight, not a mind, anything to take me out of the seriousness of what I'm about to do to myself, right? It's much more easier if I'm under the influence of something, right? Prior suicide attempts, obviously a person is at risk. And see, brothers and sisters, you will never know. People come into your church and hi, I'm a visitor come. You'll never know. Nobody's gonna tell you, hey, I've attempted suicide twice. You never know. That's why I've learned in this field and working with people, you never know who you're talking to. You never know who's sitting before you. You simply never know. You don't know what that person has been through, right? So we want to treat everybody with care and concern. Is there a family history of suicide? Okay? Anyone in family? Back in the day, you didn't talk about that. Nobody talked about how Uncle Joe died. They just said Uncle Joe died. Kind of find out Uncle Joe hung himself. What? Right? Family history. Is there a family history? Know your family history. I tell my clients, ask questions, if you can, to your mom about her life. You learn about your mom, you learn about you. You learn about your father, you learn about you.
yes.
You learn about what's in your biology. You learn about what your proclivities are. Okay? Refusal to seek help. This is a large majority of people. Keep in mind, so the research then on those, in terms of suicide statistics, that's only on people that are reported. That's only on people that's reported.
Yes.
Okay? And then, of course, stressful life events, like the loss of a job, the loss of a home, right? That term going postal, that ain't come from nowhere, right?
Right.
Yeah. Major life crisis. Moderate drinkers are at risk of suicide. Most people don't realize that the statistics that come out on alcohol and drug use, specific for alcohol, most of that research is based on moderate drinkers, not based on people that are alcoholic. Actually, the people that are alcoholic, who have alcoholism, are really a small percentage of the population. Really a small percentage of the population. So most of the statistics concerning the damaging effects of alcohol come from social drinkers. Social drinkers. Okay? Moderate drinkers are at risk of suicide and heightened suicidal thoughts and unplanned attempts. Right? Temporarily impairs judgment. We know that. May lead directly to a suicide attempt. Alcohol is in the blood of many suicide victims. And there's a reference there for that. By the way, Pastor Giles, a couple of people asked me for some slides. So if you will gather everyone's email, I will email to you the slides, and you guys can have the slides if you're interested, okay? All right, other risk factors. Serious physical illness, okay? So these are individuals who are terminal, might be terminal, right? They might be more prone. This is a big one, the anniversary of a loss. Anniversary of a loss, okay? You know, the holidays used to be a happy time. Used to be a time where everybody was happy, but you know that there are more admissions into the psychiatric hospital during the holidays than any other time during the year. You know? People just don't celebrate the holidays anymore. There's too much pain there. It reminds them of a loss. Of a loss. So anniversary of a loss is a big one. And this is probably another session or topic in and of itself, the Sabbath school lesson. By the way, I think the Sabbath school lesson is doing a wonderful job at touching on these issues that, you know, have been taboo for so long. But this issue of grief and loss, right? And what many people don't realize is that, you know, there are two parts to this process. There is certainly a part that's more emotional, okay? But then there is a psychological part as well, okay? We call it mourning. Mourning, okay? Mourning is to work on making a psychological adjustment to life without the person or thing of significant value. To know how to learn how to move on without them. And that's where many people struggle. The grief is the initial emotional presentation that some people have immediately. Sometimes it happens a little bit later. But the mourning part, people don't mourn. People don't mourn. Very interesting. If you ever get a chance to study and look at how the Jews do it, they have a intentional mourning process that is it's very impressive how they do it. They understand that this is a process, and the way they do it is excellent. Also, they have. I learned that over in Europe, every year they have a remembrance of the Holocaust. And you know what they do? They specifically invite their young people. And they bring their young people into this process, and they do a walk. They do a walk of remembrance. Very empowering. And what they have learned is this, is that since loss is inevitable, we might as well learn how we can actually grow from it. Amen. Because if we don't, with every loss, it tears us down, and it tears us further down, and so forth and so on. Right? So we've got to learn how we can actually grow from loss, become better because of it. Withdrawal, these are individuals who live in isolation. Obviously, that's a risk factor because you have the absence of social support. Homosexuality. Now, the homosexual community won't tell you that, but the reality is this is a risk factor for suicide. Okay? Heavy metal music listeners, right? because the research shows that listening to this type of music, you're more prone to depression. Country music, same thing. Heavy metal music listeners. People who have a body image disorder. This is two phases. Number one, it is women who consider themselves obese, and men who consider themselves to be too small, and they want to be big, right? And so they have what's called body image disorder, and they are more prone to attempt suicide. And of course, this goes without saying, access to lethal methods such as guns. Okay? If those are around, people have access to them, then the likelihood of someone using it to attempt suicide goes up. Major depression is the most common mood disorder. Over 350 million people worldwide. Okay? It knows no cultural, social, or economic barriers. Okay? I said black people don't get depressed. Don't you believe that?
Right.
Don't you believe that? All right? It is largely misunderstood. Okay? There is a stigma still associated with mental illness and depression. 1 out of every 3 internal medicine patients has it. Proper treatment can effectively reduce or cure it. Most can be treated on an outpatient basis. And let me say this, just because you go see somebody doesn't necessarily mean that you need to get on medication. Okay? You can have treatment without medication. Okay? That's medication therapy, but you can also have counseling as well and be an effective treatment on an outpatient basis. Okay? Now, there may be, in some cases, the need for medication, maybe for a temporary period of time. Okay? That should not be ruled out as well. But of course, we want to do all that we can from a lifestyle basis. But individuals who have clinical depression may need more. So, symptoms of depression, all right? There are 9 of them, okay? This is to be diagnosed with clinical depression. Situational depression is a little different, and we're going to distinguish right now. Deep sadness or emptiness, okay? A deep sadness or emptiness. Apathy. What's apathy? Lack of interest. Yeah. Things that used to be pleasurable and fun, you don't have any desire anymore. Don't have any. You walk past, you have a banana pudding, you just pass it up. Somebody said, well, I know I ain't depressed because I'm. All right. Agitation or restlessness. Okay? Agitation or restlessness. Sleep disturbance. Now this can go both ways. This can be lack of sleep, and it can be oversleeping. And we're going to come back to this. Weight and appetite changes can also go both ways. Not eating, right? Or overeating. Okay? Same thing with weight. Okay? This would be weight gain in a small amount of time, large weight gain, or weight loss. Significant weight loss in a short amount of time. Lack of concentration. Okay? Feelings of excessive guilt or worthlessness. This is a key and is usually included in all patients who are diagnosed with clinical depression. Okay? Feelings of worthlessness. All right? Morbid thoughts. These are thoughts of death and dying, just morbid thinking. Okay? Fatigue. Just fatigue. Okay? Now, here's the clincher. 5 or more symptoms must be present during the same 2-week period and represents a change from previous functioning. Okay? In other words, these symptoms, you need to have 5 of the 9 symptoms happening at the same time for no apparent reason. In other words, there is no obvious recent situation that that you can point to say this is probably why. Okay? These things sort of just happen out the blue. You start feeling this way for 2 weeks or more on a consistent basis. 5 or more of these symptoms. Apathy must be part of it. Also, this excessive feeling of guilt or worthlessness is also 2 that must be a part of the 5 in order for it to be diagnosed as clinical depression. For no reason. You got a nice job, you're financially comfortable, you have social support around you, and you feel this way. You can't figure out why. There's nothing that you can point to in your life to say why you should be feeling this way. And it is persistent. Okay? All right. So let's talk about 10 hit categories. These categories are developed by Dr. Neil Medley, who is the developer of this program. He is a Seventh-day Adventist physician. He is the head of the lifestyle program at Weimar Institute. He has a residential depression and anxiety recovery program at the Weimar Institute. It is I believe it's a 10-day and a 15-day program. Okay? Dr. Medley's program is used worldwide, supported by research. And what he found is an internal medicine doctor that 1 out of 4 of his clients were depressed. He didn't know much about depression, so what he did was he researched the psychiatric literature as far as the causes of depression. He found that there were over 100 causes that have been documented for depression. So he thought to himself, well, I can't tell, our patients there's maybe, 100 different things that could be wrong. So what he did was he researched further. And in the psychiatric literature, he was able to take all of those 100 and some odd causes that have been documented and break them down into 10 categories. These are the 10 categories that he was able to find and discover. Genetic, again, the causes of depression. Okay? There are not many people that are talking about what causes depression. There are many people talking about the symptoms and the treatment, but not the causes. Okay? So here are 10 hit categories of causes that were documented to have caused depression in the psychiatric literature. Genetic history was one. That simply means a family history. Yes. Somebody in your immediate family has been diagnosed with depression and or had committed suicide. There's a family history of depression. What Dr. Medley found, though, was that genetics alone was not enough to actually cause debilitating depression. Okay? It was not enough. Next factor, developmental. Developmental has to do with during your developmental years. Okay? If you experience depression in adolescence, if you were raised in homes where there was physical, emotional, verbal, or sexual abuse. Okay? Also, very interesting in this developmental, girls who started early puberty, okay, was also noted as a potential cause for depression. Okay? Now, when you look at the rest, you should notice something about the first 2. Right? What do you notice about the first 2? Yeah, there's nothing we can do about it. There's nothing we can do about our family history. And there's nothing we can do about how we were raised. Right? That's over with. So, here's the good news. The good news is that in order to have, for an individual to experience debilitating depression where it actually begins to impair their life, okay, you need 4 or more causes at the same time. So 2 alone is not enough. Amen. All right? So you can have genetic, you can have developmental, but all the other 8, you can do something about. You can address all of these others. Okay? So let's talk about what we have. Lifestyles. What did they find in the psychiatric literature with lifestyle? They found a couple of things. Number 1, individuals who did not have any regular exercise program. Okay? Number 2, individuals that did not have at least 30 minutes of sunlight exposure a day. Okay? And being is because obviously with the exercise comes the endorphins, correct? Also, with the sunlight, we know that 30 minutes of sunlight a day is enough to boost serotonin production in the brain. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that's responsible for stabilizing our mood. Okay? By the way, this was a particular type of exercise. This was aerobic exercise. You know, there's aerobic exercise and then there's anaerobic. This is not the weightlifting type. This is the cardio type of exercise that makes a difference here as far as lifestyle. Also, third thing under lifestyle, very interesting. Individuals that did not regularly breathe fresh air. Individuals who had all the windows closed at home, work in an office where there's no fresh air, come to church where there's no fresh air, right? Never outside in the fresh, open air. Okay? We'll talk about why in just a moment. Circadian rhythm. You know your circadian rhythm is your body cycle. Our body is on a 24-hour cycle. The word circa comes from a Latin word which means about a day. That means our body operates naturally. If they were to close us up, shut all the windows and remove all the lights at a certain time, we would get hungry. At a certain time, we would get sleepy. Our body's natural internal cycle, internal clock will kick in, right? And this clock works so that at the beginning of the day, the body at 12 a.m., the body actually begins a slow and steady process of waking itself up, which means the closer it gets towards the end of the day, the body starts doing what? Starts winding down. But if we're staying up or if we're eating, right, when the body's ready to lie down, we're going to have a problem, right? Also, in the circadian rhythm, what they found is individuals who slept 9 or more hours routinely a day were more prone to depression, and individuals who slept 6 hours or less a day routinely were also more prone to depression. Also, in the circadian rhythmic system, individuals who did not have a regular eating and sleeping schedule. Okay? In other words, they were just living contrary to their natural internal clock. There was no regularity there. Okay? Number 5, addiction. Okay? We've kind of already talked about that. This is all kinds of drugs and alcohol, including marijuana and nicotine. Okay? And caffeine. Also included in this addiction as a kid category. Number 6, nutrition was another problem. Okay? Elder Graves has mentioned some things about brain foods. There's a few things that you need to get in your diet for brain health. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. I've already talked about that. Number 7, toxicity. This had to do with the dyes, those types of things. Okay? The asbestos, these types of things were found. There were products. They found, the psychiatric literature found that there were certain women who were depressed and they could not figure out why. They tried it, looked everywhere, couldn't figure out why. Guess what they found? It was in their makeup products. The chemical in their makeup products. Okay? So you need to be careful. Okay? Here's another one in this category too. The chemical bismuth, found, guess where? In Pepto-Bismol. Okay? Was found to be a toxin that was contributing to depression. All right? Now, I'm just giving you the surface here. We don't have a lot of time for me to go. Plus, you guys just, ate and everything, so we're going to keep this brief, but to the point as well as practical. Number 8, social and complicated stress or grief. Individuals who have prolonged grief and didn't know how to deal with loss, okay? Also, individuals who had significant social stressors, as we talked about, loss of a job, and those things that just happen in life. These individuals weren't dealing, they were not coping with these major life events very well. Medical conditions was number 9. I should say untreated medical conditions. Now, there were not a lot of people that recorded depression because of this. Not a large percentage of people. But nonetheless, it was recorded in the psychiatric literature. There were a few untreated medical conditions, whether it's hepatitis C or cancer or any kind of medical condition that's not treated. This was a big one. And in fact, Dr. Dudley mentioned that this is the cause of depression. That is frontal lobe suppression. The research showed that individuals who were depressed had a 40% decrease in blood flow and activity in the frontal lobe. 40%. There were also several lifestyle factors that contributed to frontal lobe suppression. Spending lots of time in front of the TV, extramarital affairs, going regularly against your conscience, no regular abstract thinking, and the list goes on. These were all things that cause frontal lobe suppression. Okay? Yes.
Also masturbation.
Yes. So let's talk about briefly some helpful tips. Well, number one is kind of what we've been talking about, is to have things like this, right? Where we actually talk about these type of things, right? And this is what I say, and especially when it comes to the young people. You know, if the world kind of has gotten ahead of the church, the world talks to our young people about sex. The world talks to our young people about weed. The world talks to our young people about all of those things that the church won't touch. Amen. And we have paid the price because of it. Amen. So why can't we talk about those things from a biblical basis? You know, in worship, one week I did a whole worship on biblical sexuality from the Song of Solomon. Now my daughters were a little embarrassed and everything, but hey, the Bible talks about human sexuality in the context of marriage as a wonderful journey of the gifts of God. Amen. Amen, Sam. Amen. Wonderful. All right? So we need to get ahead of these things. We need to be talking about mental illness. We need to be talking about, you know, how are you feeling? And let's talk about why you think you're feeling that way. And take it serious. Amen. You know, take it serious. You know, a young person gets angry, take a gun to school and like, hey, what's going on? You know, that's not normal behavior. So we need to talk about these things. Seek help from a professional. Okay, there are a lot of places around here where you can seek help from a professional. You can get involved. You can sit down and talk with someone. Don't be ashamed to do that. If you, a lot of companies, if you work, they have employee assistance services where you can go and talk to somebody for free. You don't have to use your insurance. You won't be charged. You get maybe 5 or 6 sessions for free. You can just talk to somebody. Just see what's going on. And sometimes it's nice to do that, just to talk to somebody. You know, it's interesting. You know, we have this misconception that the only time you can talk to somebody when something's going wrong. You know, we do that with marriage counseling too. Like marriage in trouble, let's go get. Well, wait a minute now. You know, I was recently talking to some folks and saying, hey, you know, because it's doing good doesn't mean it can't be better, right? And why can't? What's wrong with getting some education and just learning how to be better? That's something that we just want to invest in. Period, right? So don't be afraid to go get help, and you don't have to be, you know, tell your business that, hey, I'm going to get help, and you don't have to do that. You know, that's your personal business. It's your private business. Amen. Amen. And in fact, some folks you don't want to tell, because the whole church and the whole block, you know, you come into church, Sam, you all right? How you doing? Like, come on, okay. Okay, healthy food, better mood. It's real simple. Complex carbohydrates. Now, you know there are 2 types of carbohydrates. Complex and simple. Simple carbohydrates, your junk food. Okay, potato chips, that kind of stuff. Complex carbohydrates, beans and legumes, whole grains, fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, nuts and seeds, okay? Dr. Joseph Calabrese, right here in Cleveland, at Case Western Reserve University, in 1993, did what the American Journal of Psychiatry called a landmark study. You know what he did? He took a group of people, 2 groups of people with bipolar disorder, okay? Major depression and bipolar disorder. One group put them on a placebo. Another group gave them a 3,000 milligram supplement of omega-3, right? After several weeks, what they found was the placebo group, there was no change. The group that received the omega-3, most of that group was in remission. Not only were they in remission, but they were in remission for a significantly longer period of time than any other group that they have seen. A landmark research, omega-3. Elder Gray's already mentioned, you can get omega-3 in chia seeds, flax seeds, walnuts, avocados. These things are rich in omega-3. Now, if you have nut allergies and seed allergies, you want to be careful with that. But a diet rich in complex carbohydrates will give you your omega-3. It will give you your tryptophan, okay? Your tryptophan, okay? That's required by the pineal gland in the brain. The tryptophan during the day will convert itself into serotonin. At night, that same serotonin will convert itself into melatonin. They call it the fountain of youth. That's what helps you sleep and get a restful night's sleep. You see? So these things are indispensable. All right? Also, the research shows that a diet rich in complex carbohydrates boosts serotonin production in the brain. The converse is also true. A diet low in complex carbohydrates had low serotonin production in the brain. So that not only that, but the research has found that individuals, if you do nothing else but simply improve your diet, the research shows that the average turnaround is about 2 to 3 weeks. In other words, in 2 or 3 weeks, you'll be feeling better just from eating better. Right? Isn't that a blessing?
Yes.
All right. Here's the next one. Sunlight. Sunlight. Get outside. By the way, not just during the summer, even in the winter.
Yes.
Get outside. You know, Ellen and James White, James White suffered a stroke in about, I think it was around 1867 or so. He died in about 1881. But Ellen White sought to revive him and get him going, right? You know what she did? She went around. Here's what she did, right? So the snow was really high in Michigan. She went outside with a shovel and started shoveling the water. You know why she did that? Because she knew that her husband was a man. And he was not going to be outdone by her. And so you know what he did? He got out there and started shoveling too. She said it was necessary to get him into the fresh open air and to get him active, to get him outdoors. And it took some time, but eventually James White recovered. Another thing she did was she went around to all the neighbors and said, listen, my husband's going to ask you help in the barn gathering hay. Tell him no. So James White went out, asked his neighbors, and said, no, man, I can't do all that. It forced him to get out and to do those things. And that was part of what she knew he needed to do in order to get well. So now, we live in Northeast Ohio, so we really don't get a lot of sunlight. So most of us are deficient in vitamin D, right? Now, the only way you know for sure is if you go to the doctor and you have a vitamin D level check. If you have a good doctor, they're going to do it anyway because they have that awareness, right? Now, I take a vitamin D supplement because I don't be outside in the wintertime all like that. I ain't lying. But here is another thing that you can do. You can get what they call a light box, okay? It needs to be at least 10,000 luxes. Light is measured in luxes, okay, L-U-S. So it needs to be at least 10,000 luxes, and you expose yourself to about 20 minutes or so a day, and that will also help. They do that in regions and places in the world where the sun is down most of the time. So very helpful there as well. But get out in the sunlight. Whenever the sun is shining, people feel better. Send the kids outside, right? Avoiding pessimism and negative thinking. This is a whole nother program I do on negative thinking and common thought distortions that people have. Black and white thinking, overgeneralization, mental filtering, focusing on the negative instead of the positive, labeling, emotional reasoning, personalization. These are all different types of thought distortions that people tend to have. Daily spiritual exercises and social support. People who are depressed tend to want to disconnect. They want to shut down, they want to stay away, they don't want to talk to anybody. Do you know this? The research shows that especially people who experience grief and loss, they tend to want to do that. The research shows that a person who experiences grief and loss, who disconnect from social support, has a worse experience, a worse prognosis than individuals who have a history of torture. That's how serious that is. They have a worse prognosis than individuals with a history of torture. Okay? And that's documented. That's documented. God made us to be a community. He made us for that. When we disconnect ourselves like that, we do harm to ourselves. Regular physical exercise, we talked about that, at least 30 minutes a day. Cardio, aerobic, you can do that right at home. You can do some jumping jacks. You can run in place, okay? Now, it needs to be, some people say, and my wife will do this sometimes, say, well, I clean the house. I have my, and my wife is this, my wife is really good at, she's better than me at working out. No, you know, she's actually really good at me. She's doing better than me right now. She really is. But listen, this type of exercise, your heart rate has to be up to a certain point for a period of time in order for you to get the benefit. Okay? So that's what this is talking about. In other words, you need to kind of break a sweat. Okay? You need to be doing sort of break a sweat. All right? Now, I'm not an exercise guru here, but we have a gentleman in the back here. He can help us out with that. Here's another one. Deep breathing, exercise in the fresh open air. So I live in, I live in the country. We live way out, and let me tell you something. The air is so good. So here's the thing with the air. The air is freshest in the morning. It is what we call negatively charged ionic air. That is a type of air that the research shows is invigorating and contributes to an overall sense of well-being. The air that has positively charged ions is the air that we find in the inner city that's full of pollution. And as the day wears on, the toxicity in the air increases. Right? Out in the country though, I don't have no neighbors in front of me, no neighbors, nothing but crops and trees. Beautiful. So, put plants in your home. Spend time in nature. Go on nature walks. Get out in the fresh open air. You know when the air is also good, even in the city? After the rain.
Yes.
After the rain. Boy, you ever smell the air after the rain? It's just beautiful, right? So we need that. Regular fresh air. Here's one, classical music therapy, right? The research shows that 45 minutes of traditional classical music every 2 weeks, that's it, in a 2-week period, is enough to decrease fatigue, to improve overall mood, and to support recovery from depression. Just 45 minutes of traditional classical music every 2 weeks. I have had my clients come back and challenge me with this and say, you know what, I'm going to do that. And you know, every one of them come back to me and say, you know what, I feel so much better. I play it in my car. And it just, the research shows that kids, if they're listening to traditional classical music in the background of math tests, they actually score higher on their math tests. Wow. The research showed us that classical music helped with the development of the brain. Right? Aristotle said this: the right kinds of music produce the right kind of person. The wrong kind of music produce the wrong kind of person. And he said that way back when. But that's true today, you know. Music is a major influencing factor. And what we're learning here is that the right type of music, is healing to the brain. What did I do? I hadn't heard that, but I don't have certain. It was mentioned about pine trees. Yeah. I can believe that. I can believe that. Stress control measures. Okay, here are our coping skills for stress and grief that we talked about, social support. Here's another one. Hydrotherapy, the use of water. You know, Ellen talked about the use of baths. Everybody take a shower nowadays. But the use of, boy, there's something here for it, there's something soothing about a bath. Woo-hoo, when last time you took a bath? Where I remember when I was younger, my mother said, boy, go get us time for your bath. Right? A bath. She said there's some healing to a warm bath, especially before bedtime. Ooh, especially if you got one of them iron, you remember them big iron tubs with the claws as feet? Ooh, boy, what? All right. So also, In Dr. Nelly's residential program, you have his clients every day taking hot, cold showers. Okay? Now, you don't want to scold yourself, but usually you start out with the warm, 1 minute warm, 30 seconds cold, and you do that for about 3 or 4 rounds, and you end with the cold. You end, I know it's brutal. But it sure does invigorate the system. It stimulates the disease-fighting cells in your body so that it helps the body to ward off and fight off disease. Really good. So that's important. And then lastly, the owning of a pet. Now, Sister Weed would say that we never really had animals around because Mom just didn't like animals.
I do like animals, but they're like children. You know, you have to get the shots and feed them. They're like children.
Therefore, we never had, not even a goldfish. All right, last thing, and this is it. I've enjoyed my time with you guys. I want to turn you on to some community-based ministries that will help you to minister to the sick and suffering, right? So I've talked about Dr. Nelly's anxiety depression recovery program. That's something that the church can do as a small group ministry. We've done that, and I'm telling you, the results are sure. The results are sure. You can get training. It's a training online. It's like 16 hours. It costs, but it is worth it. It might be maybe $200 or something, but you get all the material that comes with it, all the books, the workbooks, the reading material. It is wonderful, so I would encourage you to look into that. Also, Vicki Griffiths from the Michigan Conference, she's developed a program called Lifestyle Matters. It's a series, right? Living Free, that's the series on addiction. Simple Solutions, that's a series on dealing with stress. And Foods for Thought, well, that's the series dealing with proper nutrition, food and mood, okay? There are workbooks that also come with that. I think actually Elder Graves quoted from the Living Free book in his presentation. Also, I don't know if you've heard of Wesley Youngberg's whole family of doctors. Listen to me. This stuff is called Win Wellness, okay? It's like an evangelistic series, but it's health-oriented. Dr. Youngberg starts talking about the genome and how there are 3,500 basic genes and how those genes are influenced, right, by our actions and how we can change our gene pool. Man, listen. This stuff, and I'm going to tell you how I know this works, because this is stuff that I share and utilize with people who are non-Adventist, who are non-Christian, and they eat it up. Eat it up. And that's why I love. Somebody asked me earlier, hey, do you want a pastor? Nope. My ministry is among the sick and the suffering, out in the street. I love it. You drop these little gems, they eat it up. It's life-saving to them. That's where I'm at home. That's my church out there. I love it. I wouldn't trade it for anything. And I'm so glad that God directed me here. But these are some things here that are very valuable. Most of what I utilize is our stuff. It's stuff from our Adventist health missionaries and medical missionaries. And I'm telling you, it's second to none. So I just want to encourage you, these are some things that you can use. It is an investment. Every year, the North American Division does what they call a health summit. They have these things and they have much more. They have programs on pain management, programs on diabetes, all of it. What we did one year is we sent representatives from our church down. We had them go through the training. We had them come back, train us. We ran the programs. It's an investment. It's time and it's money. But I'm telling you, once you have it, you have it. And once again, I want to thank you for allowing me to spend this time with you. I hope these things have been helpful to you. May God bless you. May God bless your ministry. May God bless your homes. May God bless your individual lives. I just want to pray for you right now and pray for your church and for the pastor that God will continue to use you.
Can I before you pray, because you shared a lot, especially talking about the post-traumatic distress and the mindset of the people out there, the people that come into the church, and we need to be able to minister to them when they come into the church. And these resources help train us to be able to minister to the people that God will send. If we're not prepared to minister to his people, he's not going to send people to us. So when we get prepared, then God will send the people to us. We need to know how to minister to them. We really do. Yeah.
Let's pray. Dear Jesus, Lord, I want to thank you so much for, we've just had a high Sabbath, Lord. We've enjoyed learning, we've enjoyed the presence of your Spirit, we've enjoyed Christian fellowship and community. We've enjoyed being reminded of our mission and our vision, Lord, and how you have equipped us to be able to be useful, Lord. Not only that, but you've given us hope even within our own lives. You've challenged us to be better, to be healthier, both physically, mentally, and emotionally. And so now, Lord, as we go forward, as we end our time together here, I just want to pray for the Maranatha Seventh-day Adventist Church. I want to pray for the members that are represented here, each and every family, each and every individual, man, woman, boy, and girl. I want to pray for the leadership team, their elders, their pastor, their pastor's wife. I want to pray that you will continue to give them vision, Lord, continue to expand their territory, Lord, that they might be effective in ministering to the extended congregation and the members of their family, as well as their community. Thank you so much for what you are doing and for what you will continue to do in us and through us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.